This page right then, it's the front cover of N64 Magazine, issue 41, from May 2000. Big and bold N64 logo right at the top, you can't miss it. Headline shouting about, more games, more pages, more tips, more challenges. Typical magazine cover blurb trying to get you to pick it up off the shelf. The main focus is clearly Pokemon Stadium, splashed across the middle in massive letters, saying, reviewed inside, Pokemon Stadium monster battling on your N64. Pokemon Stadium, I remember that. Monster battling in 3D on your telly. After all that Game Boy business, it was quite something at the time. Charizard breathing fire, you can see him there. Down the side we've got latest news on, with Zelda. Majora's Mask saying, stunning highest shots, it's incredible. Majora's Mask, eh? That was a weird one, wasn't it? Dark and a bit creepy compared to Ocarina, but still a Zelda game, so you knew it was going to be good. Then there's Turok 3, Oblivion levels exposed in exclusive new pics. Turok, dinosaurs and guns, classic N64 action, always a bit of fun for blasting through. Tipped inside, Ridge Racer 64, open up all the tracks and cars. Ridge Racer on the N64 felt a bit like a step down from the arcade, but still, more racing games are always welcome. And Resident Evil 2 finished the bonus missions in style. Resident Evil 2 on the N64, now that was a proper conversion, pretty impressive they got that running on the machine. Phasey. Top left there's a circle shouting, first ever shots, the world is not enough revealed inside. James Bond on the N64, everyone was keen for that after GoldenEye, wasn't quite the same magic though, was it? Still, first looks are always interesting. Error. Bottom left, plus, Planet Game Boy, the original and best Game Boy mag inside. Bit cheeky calling themselves the best, weren't they? Game Boy was still going strong back then though. Pokemon on the go, can't go wrong. And there's a little Blastoise fella pointing at something. Look! Flip up your N64 challenge book to see what other stunning games are inside. They were always giving away bits and bobs with these mags, weren't they? Keeps you coming back for more. Issue number 41, May 2000, £3.25. That's your lot for this cover. This page is the welcome page to issue 41 of N64 Magazine, dated May 2000. It proudly declares itself as Britain's biggest and best-selling independent Nintendo mag, which back then it probably was, to be fair. They're laying out their stall right from the get-go, explaining why they reckon they're top dog. Apparently they have correspondents all over the place getting first-hand news. And they don't just copy rumors off the internet, which was a big deal even then. They're keen to point out they write independent reviews because they're not tied to Nintendo directly, so they can be honest if a game's a bit pants. Their focus is clearly N64 games, obviously, and they even have a coveted Star Game Award. Right at the bottom there's a little dig at the competition, telling readers not to be fooled by feeble imitations. Bit strong, but hey, that's mags for you. The editor's letter, under the headline, Stadium Filling, talks about the N64 still being a hot console at this point. He mentions a few recent classics like Resident Evil 2, Top Gear Rally 2, and Ridge Racer 64, all solid games, no arguments there. This month's big hitter is Pokemon Stadium, which gets a massive 12-page review. Seems fair enough, Pokemon was massive and a proper stadium battle game on the N64 was pretty exciting. Warrington. Then they're teasing what else is inside. The World Is Not Enough, on page 8, that's the Bond game, getting first look screenshots, which would have been pretty cool at the time. Zelda, Majora's Mask on page 6, promising glorious highest shots. It was a look at that game, even if a bit strange. Turok 3 is in there on page 16, with new enemies, new weapons, all new Dinoshots. Can't go wrong with a bit of Turok. And Ridge Racer 64 gets some tips on page 82 for shattering course records. Always useful for bragging rights down the pub. Finally, Resident Evil 2 gets a guide to bonus games on page 88. Not bad for one issue, covering a decent range. However, they're also plugging the next issue, on sale Monday the 15th of May, and hinting at some fantastic jump to page 120. Classic magazine cliffhanger. So yeah, standard welcome page, setting the scene for the mag and what's inside. This page of the N64 magazine contents, blimey, issue 41 May 2000, takes me back. Right at the top in big letters it says, Contents, so you know what you're in for. First off, Planet 64 feet section. There's a news desk bit on page 10, with first shots of Sapphire's staggering new Dolphin game. Now, that's intriguing. Dolphin was the code name for the GameCube back then, wasn't it? Wonder what that game was all about. Then, coming soon, on page 16, promises stunning new shots and mouth-watering info on the latest games. Always good to see what's on the horizon. Moving down, we've got N64 Arena starting on page 44. UK releases, reviewed, rated, and completed. So, the usual reviews and stuff. Pokemon Stadium is on page 46, asking, will Pokemon battling it out on your N64 prove a monster hit? Well, Pokemon was massive, wasn't it? Stadium was probably going to be pretty popular. Page 58 is Daikatana. First person blasting from the folk behind Quake. Big hype around that one, John Romero and all that, wonder if it lived up to it. Winback on page 62 is At Last, a UK release for this fabulous stealth sim. Stealth games were getting big then, good to see one on the N64. Track and Field is page 66, reinforced fingers at the ready for the N64 Olympics. Button Basher's dream that was. Tony Hawk's on page 70, the world's premier skateboarding sim arrives. Tony Hawk's was a game changer, everyone was trying to ollie and grind after playing that. Import Arena starts on page 74, the latest Japanese and American games. Ooh, imports, always a bit exotic. Custom Robo is highlighted, the Japanese just love their giant fighting robots. Yeah, they do, don't they? Giant robots are always cool. Finally, regulars. Information Station on page 24 for charts, release schedules, your favorite games, it's all here. Standard stuff. N64 Magazine issue 42 feet on page 120 promises. We've got something massive lined up for next issue. Teasing the next issue already. And N64, on page 122, where Turok and Addon invite you into their lovely abode. Presumably wrapping things up with some characters. Oh, and a Little Planet Game Boy section mentions, read the first review of Metal Gear Solid in our Game Boy Only magazine. Metal Gear on the Game Boy Color, that's pretty impressive actually. Boy Only magazine. 35, whatever that means. Probably page 35 of their Game Boy mag. Right, that's the contents page. All covered. This page is the contents page for the magazine. Right then, let's see what's inside. We've got the Future Look section, teasing some big new N64 games, always exciting to see what's on the horizon. Then straight in with Zelda, Majora's Mask, tons of screenshots. It says, well, that was the game everyone was gagging for at the time, wasn't it? Wonder if they finally sorted out the frame rate issues from Ocarina. Next up, The World Is Not Enough. Bond's latest game getting the first ever shots. GoldenEye was a hard act to follow, let's be honest, but they kept trying, didn't they? Gore. Down the side we've got the regular sections. N64, Club 64, the Reader Service, and then How To, guides for Ridge Racer 64 and Resident Evil 2. Ridge Racer on the 64 was alright, not a massive leap from the PlayStation 1 though, was it? Resident Evil 2, now that was a proper game, even if it was a bit scary for some. Club 64 Mailbox, Tips Extra, Dr. Kit's Game Clinic, usual magazine fodder, Game On with challenges, I'm the best for high scores, and Skill Club 64, something new called Millennium Skill Club. Blimey, Millennium already. Where did the time go? There's also a directory of reviewed games, back issues and subscriptions. The big features in the middle are Pokemon Stadium. Fancy watching your Pokemon battling it out in 3D? Well, they knew their audience alright. Professor Oak's plastered all over it. Then Special Investigation on Stunt Racer 64, thrilling stunt-packed racing from Midway. Stunt Racer, that wireframe graphics game. Bit of a Marmite game, that one, you either loved it or hated it. Whatever happened to looking into secretive games? And finally, Bad Losers, asking, why does the bad guy never win? Featuring Ganondorf, naturally. Good question actually, maybe they'll finally have some answers. Right, page 5, May 2000, let's get stuck in. This page screams of excitement for upcoming N64 titles, doesn't it? The big headline grabs you straight away, Future Look, promising your first look at the best new N64 games. And rightly so, because front and center is Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. Everyone was properly buzzing about this back then after Ocarina of Time. They're calling it Majula here, which is a bit odd. I remember it was always Majora. They reckon Nintendo of America changed the name for some reason, probably something lost in translation. Either way, they're saying it's looking superb and coming out in Japan in just 4 weeks. Mind-boggling when we'd waited 3 years for Ocarina. They're calling it an alternate Hyrule in Majora's Mask, and the screenshots certainly look a bit different. Topsy-turvy, they say, which is about right looking at them. They mention familiar enemies like Deku Scrubs though. There's talk of pastel-colored buildings and stripy garden walls, and they even mention seeing Death Mountain in the distance, so it's still Hyrule, just a bit warped. They're pointing out a horse race against Ingo, and some dungeon bits with a little key icon. And they mention underwater evil plants, which sounds like classic Zelda weirdness. There's an info burst box, which is a bit like a quick fact sheet. It confirms it's from Nintendo, on a 256 megabit cartridge standard N64 stuff. Says it's one player, needs an expansion pack but not a controller or transfer pack, but does need a rumble pack. Of course it does. They're predicting a Christmas release over here and May in Japan, and giving it full marks for anticipation. Down in the corner there's a smaller mention of The World Is Not Enough, the Bond game, which is getting an 8 out of 10 rating. So Zelda's hogging the limelight, as it should, but Bond's there too for those who like a bit of shooting. Overall, this page is pure hype for Majora's Mask, and who could blame them? It was the game everyone was waiting for. This page is a future look at Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. It seems to be a preview from N64 Magazine. We're getting a peek at Link in this rather bizarre-looking Zelda game. They're pointing out some of the new bits, like Link learning to play the drums from a Goron, and the fact he can transform using masks. There's mention of a twin Ingo bit, and a wonky facial hair city, which sounds a bit odd, doesn't it? They also mention Link having to unfreeze Goron domain, and something about Skull Kid statues blocking routes. It's all a bit mysterious, talking about a mysterious shipwreck miles away that you can swim to. They're hyping up the new tools Link will have, including a new type of sword made of cutlass blades. The reviewer reckons Nintendo's level designers are brilliant, naturally, and they're promising more shots next issue, and hopefully a review in issue 43. May 2000, eh? Time flies. This page in N64 Magazine, issue 41 it looks like, is previewing The World Is Not Enough game. They're calling it a future look. Must have been quite early days for it. Blimey, Eurocom on Bond again, eh? After GoldenEye, everyone was hoping for another cracker, weren't they? They're really pushing the boat out with the graphics, talking about muzzle flare, floor reflections, even frosted glass doors. Bit much really for the N64 at the time, were we dreaming? Still, it's nice to see them try. Apparently they're saying it's like an unofficial sequel to GoldenEye, which is a bold claim, considering how good GoldenEye was. They mention all the Bond gadgets and Q-branch stuff, which is standard Bond fare. Sounds like there's boat chases on the Thames and street levels, which is a bit more varied than just corridors. They're keen on the details, saying you can use a zoomable sniper rifle and guards will surrender. Surrendering guards? Sounds a bit soft for Bond, doesn't it? Worried. There's a little info burst section. Cart size is 256 megabits, which is decent for back then, and 1 to 4 players. Standard stuff. Expansion pack and rumble pack are supported, of course they are. Gotta have the rumble. Release date is autumn, with a TBA for Japan. Anticipation rating is 4 out of 5 red circles, so they're pretty hyped about it. Looks alright I suppose, but GoldenEye had set the bar pretty high, hadn't it? Let's see if it lives up to the hype. This page is previewing The World Is Not Enough on the N64. Looks like they're well impressed with it. They are saying the graphics are a step up from GoldenEye, which is quite a claim considering how groundbreaking GoldenEye was back in the day. They're mentioning Eurocom are the developers, the same chaps who did Duke Nukem, 0 Hour, so they know their stuff. Apparently Bond's got his usual arsenal of 40 weapons, and there are 10 massive levels, going from MI6 to Azerbaijan, bit of globetrotting action as you'd expect. They're raving about the lighting and shadow effects, fancy for the N64. The sound design is also highlighted, especially the echoing footsteps, which adds to the stealth element. A bit like the bunker levels in GoldenEye, they reckon. They've added a jump button, a new feature for Bond games on the 64, and your footsteps can alert guards if you're not careful, which sounds like a decent bit of tension. 4-player multiplayer is in there as well, naturally, and controllable vehicles. They're calling it 00 Heaven, and seem genuinely excited about it, saying it's incredible stuff. Right at the bottom it says to be continued, and there will be a special investigation of Twine in the next issue. Must be the acronym for The World Is Not Enough. This is from May 2000, page 9 of the magazine. The next page, we're looking at the news desk section, Planet 64. Big news at the time obviously was all about the Dolphin, which we now know as the GameCube. 2001. A Dolphin Odyssey, it blares. Seems they were expecting delays, and rightly so. Predictable delays abound, but Dolphin is definitely on. Typical Nintendo, keeping us hanging on. The article talks about Nintendo announcing at a game developers conference that Europe and the States wouldn't see Dolphin in 2000. US launch delayed to the first half of 2001, and Europe even later, 6 months after that. They mention Microsoft revealing the Xbox, calling it a turbocharged PC in the shape of a gigantic Chrome X with a lava lamp in the middle. Bit harsh, but kind of true, wasn't it? Worldwide launch for Xbox in the second half of 2001. Nintendo's delays were frustrating, apparently, especially with the competition heating up. But they reckon it'll give developers time to make good games. They mentioned Japan getting Dolphin first at the end of the year, and the launch games being similar to PlayStation 2's driving, fighting and mahjong games, which, you know, Japan loves. But the really juicy stuff, like a new Mario game from Miyamoto, will come later for the US launch, and by the time it hits Europe, there'll be a decent selection of must-have games. Third-party support is important, but unclear how many developers have dev kits. There's a picture of a blue bag that says, "I'm a Nintendo Dolphin developer dev kit enclosed, with a toy dolphin inside." Nintendo's humor, eh? They reckon other console makers, especially Microsoft, would kill for a look at the Dolphin controller. Apparently the Xbox prototype controller was described as evil, and nobody's seen the Dolphin pad yet, not until close to the Japanese launch. Then there's a Dolphin timeline. May 2000 at E3 in LA. Big Dolphin announcement expected. Nintendo of America to outline specs and maybe show potential behind closed doors to third-party developers like Namco. August 2000, Japan Summer Space World Show. Confirmed unveiling of Dolphin. Games from Nintendo, Rare, Factor 5, NSTC, Factor 5 and Left Field to be shown in Tokyo, plus some surprise titles from Japanese developers. December 2000, Dolphin launch in Japan. Western launch delayed to 2001, but Eastern release this year, a must. Key titles ready, but maybe not Mario. Launch lineup with Beat 'em Up and Racer. April 2001. Could US and UK launch be simultaneous? Slim chance. Nintendo focused on US launch at Easter. Key titles available at launch including Rare and Factor 5 stuff, plus translated Ninty games. September 2001. More likely for UK and Europe is September launch, up against Xbox. Downside is wait, upside is by autumn. Machine will probably have 10 or 12 great titles. And a BUT, remember, section. Keep an eye on Australian launch date. Nintendo in Oz are on the ball and get things done quicker than UK. Dolphin could be in PAL format in Australia as early as May or June. So yeah, delays were expected, but still, exciting times for the next Nintendo console. The next page in this issue is titled Perfect Promo, and it's a bit of a mixed bag. First up, there's a PokeWatch section highlighting the latest Pokemon craze hitting Burger King. Seems they were pushing Pokemon toys in their kids' meals, you know, the usual water squirters, keyrings, beanies, bits and bobs like that. Apparently, there were even special swap evenings for kids desperate to complete their sets. Good grief. They also mentioned Pokemon cereal from Kellogg's, which, surprise surprise, was also emblazoned with Pokemon characters like Pikachu and Squirtle. It was all timed with the first Pokemon movie, naturally. Then there's a section called Datadyne Website Exposed, which is quite interesting. It talks about the Datadyne website, the fictional corporation from Perfect Dark, and how eagle-eyed gamers had found a restricted access area. Apparently, by using a leaked ID code, Jamestown 07 8CR31D29, you could get into this hidden part of the site and see some spooky stuff. It mentions something about it feeling like Blair Witch, which was the big horror film at the time. There are screenshots from Perfect Dark showing Joanna Dark in the Datadyne HQ, in areas called Stairs, Lab, and Delta, looking like she's doing her usual thing, infiltrating and taking down bad guys. Finally, there's a Dolphin Speak section, labeled number 5 in a series about complicated Dolphin jargon. Dolphin being the codename for the GameCube, of course. This one's about S3TC, which stands for S3 Texture Compression. Basically, it's a tech that lets the GameCube handle loads more detailed textures without needing masses of memory. They're saying it's a big deal for graphics and will make GameCube games look much sharper and more detailed than what you'd see elsewhere, even on a PC at the time running something like Unreal. Bit techie for a casual reader, but I suppose some people are into that sort of thing. This page has got a bit of everything going on, typical magazine fodder really. Kicking off, we've got some Pokemon news. Heinz is doing Pikachu ketchup mental, isn't it? Putting Pikachu's face on ketchup bottles. Those crazy Americans. And Burger King are pushing Pokemon videos with kids' meals, more junk food and pocket monsters. Seems to be the way of things back then. Then there's a bit about Pokemon in Canada and French versions. Must be a big deal for them over there. Warrington Nulsa. The main chunk of the page is about a new first-person shooter called Just Bang On, apparently showing off what Nintendo's next console, codenamed Dolphin, can do. They're saying it's like Rainbow Six but with more stealth, and a bit GoldenEye and Siphon Filter thrown in for good measure. Seems like they're really pushing the graphics, jaw-dropping and all that. They've got some screenshots of a subway level with soldiers and sniper rifles. Looks alright, I suppose, bit blocky compared to what we'd see later. But for the time, yeah, it probably did look quite impressive. PlayStation 2 beating visuals, they reckon. Bit of a bold claim there. They're talking about picking off terrorists in a subway. Bit standard shooter fare. But hey, it's what we were playing back then. Warn you. Then there's the N64 quiz, of course, 50 quid up for grabs, not to be sniffed at. 10 questions, all about N64 games. Looks like your usual mix of trivia. asking about fighting Pokemon, in-game commentators, game names, characters like Snorlax, RT Savaloo, vegetable characters in Resi 2, and David Newell, whoever he is, then some Game Boy Game of the Month, and Pokemon. Standard magazine quiz stuff, to be honest. Vegetable, you've got the How to Enter blurb and last month's winner Neil Wooding from Kent getting a shout-out, probably chuffed with himself, and then the answer form to fill out, name, address, postcode, the usual rigmarole. All in all, a pretty standard page of N64 Magazine, bit of news, game preview, quiz to keep you flicking through. This page in Planet 64 Inches features a selection of new bits and bobs, mostly Pokemon tat if I'm honest. First up, we have a Pokemon Candy Catcher mini skateboard. It's basically a finger skateboard, a bit like those executive toys but plastered with Pokemon. Apparently, kids at the magazine have been trying to do ollies and stalefishes on it, probably dreaming they are Tony Hawk. It's a candy dispenser as well, a bit like a Pez thing but with a Pokemon picking up the sweet, rather than Goofy's gormless face. Then there's a Nerf gun, described as harmless violence, which is fine for the N64 office. Seems they were having a bit of a war zone at the magazine at the time, with foam darts flying about. It can apparently fire up to 10 meters, just far enough to annoy Will at the end of the office it seems. Next we have the Hydro Zap game, which is a water pistol game. They're comparing it to Simon, the electronic memory game from back in the day. You have to press buttons when the lights come on, to avoid getting a face full of water. Sounds a bit messy. Quarantine. After that, it's Pokemon Sweets. They've got Poppet-style chocolate things, and Togepi lollipops with sherbet dibdabs. They mention these sweets come in boxes adorned with monsters from Pokemon Gold and Silver, which were the big games back then, weren't they? Apparently the sherbet dibdabs is actually exploding powder stuff, which they say is a bit disconcerting but fun. The picture on the packet shows Ash being electrocuted, which they find slightly worrying. Rightly so, I'd say. Boruto. Finally, there's a Pokemon watch. They admit digital watches are a bit unfashionable, but this one's Pokemon, so that makes it alright, apparently. It comes in Squirtle, Pikachu and Charmander designs, and it even makes Pokemon noises. Very worrying indeed, they joke. Joch. The page is rounded off with a competition to win a Pokemon mini skateboard, asking what word is missing from the phrase, Pikachu, I choose. The options are, bananas, you, or a life-threatening disease. Bit of a strange question that. You had to send a postcard to N64 Magazine in Bath to enter. This page delves into the world of retro gaming, kicking off with some bits about Pokemon. Apparently Warner Bros are doing some Willy Wonka thing with golden tickets in Pokemon videos, and you could win a trip to Japan. Right then. And there's another Pokemon piece saying Gold and Silver are selling loads, surprise surprise. See Burley. Moving on, there's a feature called a double bill of classy Konami classics, which takes me right back. They're looking at Track and Field and Metal Gear. Track and Field, blimey, button bashing madness from '83. They mention snapping fingers and numb wrists, which is spot on. I remember those arcade cabinets, hammering those buttons to get your athlete to move. Good times, even if your mates were always better than you. Then it moves on to Metal Gear from '87. They're showing screenshots and talking about Solid Snake sneaking around. It's funny how they describe his infiltration methods as tiptoeing and exchanging pleasantries. It was a bit more involved than that, wasn't it? But yeah, Metal Gear, on the NES, proper classic. They even mention the cardboard box, iconic stuff. Finally, there's a retro preview section for Space Invaders. Apparently, Crave are bringing out Space Invaders 64 for the N64. They reckon it's a 3D update, with 100 levels and loads of different invaders and power-ups. Sounds like they're going for cooperative and competitive two-player, which could be a laugh. TBA NOS on the release date, typical. After waiting 22 years though, a few more months probably isn't going to kill anyone, is it? They've got a little picture of the new invader, looks a bit more menacing than the old blocky ones. This page is all about what's coming soon for the N64, typical preview stuff you'd see back then. It's called Planet 64 Coming Soon. Very dramatic. They've got a quick jump-to section, pointing to different game previews inside. Looks like Taz Express, Aiding Chronicles, Army Men and StarCraft are featured in this issue. The main chunk of the page is dedicated to Turok 3. There's a Q&A section, answering some burning questions about it. Apparently there are two characters to play as. Joseph, who's a nipper so he can squeeze into small spaces, and Danielle, who's tall. Apparently that's her special skill, right? Revolutionary stuff. They're also talking about weapon upgrades instead of new weapons, Joseph's shotgun becoming a napalm launcher, and Danielle's something automatic. Sounds alright. There are some screenshots, typical blurry N64 fare, one with a big monster that they reckon popped up in Rage Wars before, and another robot cop thing they call it, then raptors making a return, and some proper ugly-looking creature they can't quite identify charming. The info burst bit gives you the facts and figures, 256 megabit cart, 1 to 4 players, controller expansion and rumble packs are all go, transfer packs are no. It's slated for September, and they've given it a decent anticipation rating, 4 out of 5 orbs. The article itself is saying these new Turok 3 shots aren't showing off its full potential, moaning about fog and suspect enemies. But they reckon it's shaping up to be good, definitely better than the last Turok game Seeds of Evil, which had framerate issues, the bane of our lives back then. They compare it to Resident Evil Adventure mixed with DK64 Exploration, which sounds like a bit of a mashup, doesn't it? And yeah, we'll apparently hear more next month. Typical magazine cliffhanger, keeps you coming back for more, doesn't it? This page is all about Bomberman, the second attack for the N64. Seems Hudson are having another crack at Bomberman on the 64, after their previous efforts were a bit pants, especially the multiplayer in Bomberman 64. Apparently that was about as fun as a wet weekend in Grimsby. And Bomberman Hero, well, they didn't even bother with multiplayer. Unforgivable, really. Anyway, this second attack is trying to get back to the SNES Bomberman days, good old multiplayer mayhem. They're saying the single player is a bit more of a Mario-style adventure, with 7 worlds and different routes, and a Pokemon-style sidekick called Pommy. You get him as an egg and he follows you about, helping you out. You can even power him up with food. A bit like Floyd from Jet Force Gemini, they reckon, where a second player can control him in single player to shoot enemies. Sounds a bit gimmicky if you ask me. The screenshots show it's 3D obviously, but they're aiming for that classic Bomberman multiplayer feel. There's talk of fire bombs, ice bombs, water bombs, lightning bombs, and even hurricane bombs. A bomb for every occasion, apparently. The multiplayer is back to 4 players bombing each other in maze-style arenas, like the good old SNES days. Thank goodness for that. Warrington. Down at the bottom there's an info burst box. Typical mag stuff. It says it's from Hudson, cart size is 128 megabits, supports 1 to 4 players, controller and rumble packs yes to both. No expansion or transfer packs though. Release date is down as summer in the US and UK, and Japan already got it. Anticipation rating is 4 out of 5 red blobs, with a little green go button. Oh wait, no go. Go. Just go. Right. May 2000? This is from Go, so summer release sounds about right. Hopefully it's not another damp squib like the last Bomberman games on this console. Fingers crossed, eh? This page is all about Taz Express. Looking at the screenshots, it's one of those 3D platformers that were 10 a penny on the N64 back then. Seems you're lugging crates around as Taz, and apparently if you crash, fall or drown, the crate goes back to the start. Clever. They say it's important to clear a path before hoisting the box. Makes sense, I suppose, and there are safe tiles to leave the box on. Looks like later in the game you have to protect the crate from other Looney Tunes characters, like Wile E. Coyote, Marvin the Martian, and Yosemite Sam. Right bunch of reprobates they are. Apparently there are 36 levels spread across 6 different worlds, starting in the desert, and then moving to cities, alien planets, and the Wild West. Sounds like they are throwing everything at it. Titeu. The screenshots show bits of scenery can be smashed, and giant pizza restores energy, which is a bit standard. They are calling the popcorn pieces coins, naturally. There's a shot of a city level, which they say is called Big City Small Taz, and it's full of traffic and tricky, unsurprisingly. And there's mention of fog, typical British weather, even in a game. Eva. The Infoburst box tells us it's from Infogrames. 96 megabit cart, 1 player, controller and rumble packs are supported but no expansion or transfer pack. And it was out in June in the UK and US, with Japan TBA. Anticipation rating is 3 out of 5, so not exactly setting the world on fire then. Seems alright, I suppose, another platformer to add to the pile. This page delves into Aiding Chronicles, which they're billing as a proper full-on RPG for the N64. They're making some bold comparisons, saying it's like mixing Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time with Dungeons & Dragons. Sounds ambitious, doesn't it? For the N64, that's quite a claim. Ocarina. Apparently it's got turn-based combat and experience-based skills, which is a bit more traditional RPG than Zelda, isn't it? They're promising over 100 monsters, 50 weapons, and 60 spells. It's a fully 3D world, and they're talking about trekking through jungles, up mountains, and into snowy areas, so quite a bit of variety in the environments. And you can have a party of up to 10 characters, which is quite a lot. Warrington Knee. The screenshots show a chap wandering around a 3D town, and some outdoor landscapes. In the Infoburst box, it says it's from THQ, 128 meg cart size, and it's a single-player game. Controller and rumble pack acts are supported, but no expansion or transfer pack. Release is down as June for the UK, and they've given it a pretty good anticipation rating, 4 out of 5. Sounds like they're hoping for big things with this one. What? Gag. Over on the right, there's one of those competitions they used to run all the time. The coolest competition. Loads of prizes, Dreamcast console, MP3 player, MIDI hi-fi, mini disc player, even a PlayStation, mobile phone, pocket TV, and some trainers. You know the sort of thing. Call the premium rate number to enter. Standard magazine filler, really. This page showcases Army Men Air Combat for the N64. It's looking at the game, calling it the latest in the 3DO Plastic Soldier series. They're saying it's all about nuclear strike-style helicopter action, and mentions you can even use a chicken as a weapon, which sounds a bit daft, doesn't it? The game is set in real-world locations like gardens and beaches, made to look like battlefields. In a Q&A section, they're talking about the helicopters, mentioning Chinook, Huey, Apache and Super Stallion, saying they vary in speed and power, and you can even have a co-pilot to work a winch. Multiplayer modes are Air Rescue, Food Fight, Bug Hunt and Flag Nabbit, which they say are suitably offbeat, and you use the winch to collect bits and pieces. There's a bit about what you can winch up: Coke cans, food, small things. Apparently in one mission you drop sugary donuts to lure ants, which are bigger than the soldiers. And they ask, is there anything donuts can't do, saying, in this game, the donut is king. Bit strong, isn't it, for a donut? They're pointing out that you can destroy scenery, which was always good fun back then, blowing up trees and that. And they mention deadly spiders, warning about arachnophobia, which is a bit of a laugh. The infoburst box gives details like it's from 3DO, is a 128 megabits cart, 1 to 4 players, controller and rumble packs are supported but not expansion or transfer packs. It was due out in May in the UK and US, and TBA in Japan. Anticipation rating is 4 red dots, so they're clearly quite keen on it. The next page focuses on the Power Rangers game coming to the N64. Right then, Power Rangers on the N64? Well, those screenshots look functional, I suppose. They're saying it's like the TV show, but hopefully, the gameplay is better than those wobbly monster costumes. Apparently there are 30 levels all about monster mishaps and city-wide fights, which sounds like a typical Power Rangers plot. They're even promising all the Rangers and monsters like Magmavor, so fans will probably be pleased. Interesting they mention it's for the under 10s. Makes sense, really, doesn't it? They're trying to excuse the graphics by saying it's action-packed and you can drive Zord's giant robots, naturally, and bash alien beasts in city locations. Sounds like a bit of mindless fun, maybe better than that Superman game on the console, which was a proper stinker. Release date is October, apparently. There's a section with console offers N64 with expansion pack, Pokemon Stadium, Donkey Kong 64, Star Wars Racer and a nuclear N64, all bundled up for a price. Then a massive list of N64 games for sale, new and second-hand. You've got everything from your 1080 snowboarding and Zelda to Fighting Force and Wipeout 64. Whole load of titles there, really covering the spectrum of what the N64 had to offer. Prices seem about right for back then. Game Boy Color games are listed too: Donkey Kong Land, Final Fantasy, Pokemon, you know the drill. Gorington U. There's a competition to win an N64 and Pokemon gear by answering a question about Pokemon number 114. Gotta love a bit of free stuff. Also got some licensed Nintendo bits and bobs, like Nintendo beanies, Donkey Kong and Sonic action figures, and N64 wheels and rumble packs. Rumble packs, yeah, remember those vibrating controllers? Felt like cutting-edge tech at the time. Game Boy accessories are listed too: rumble packs, lights, link cables, all the usual stuff. And finally, some Pokemon merchandise like beanies and shirts. All in all, a pretty standard page for the time, pushing the latest games and gear alongside some deals and extras. This page is all about StarCraft coming to the N64. Command and Conquer in Space, they're calling it. Seems like a big deal at the time, bringing PC strategy games to the console. They're saying it's got all the depth and tactical thinking of the PC version, which was massive back then. Everyone was playing StarCraft on their computers. This N64 version promises new missions, exclusive levels, and split-screen 2-player mode. They highlight the 3 races you can play as: Protoss, Terran and Zerg, each with their own weapons and abilities. The reviewer reckons they've played an almost complete version, and it's as slick and professional as Command and Conquer, another big strategy game of the time, and promises a review in the next issue. There's a Q&A section too. Apparently there are about 30 levels in the finished game, some from the PC version but redesigned for the N64. They also mention the 2-player mode is split screen, and you can battle a mate in Cosmic Strategy and General Mayhem, or play against the N64 itself. They are calling the N64 AI the Forces of Evil. Bit dramatic, innit? It seems like they're saying it's almost a whole new game, not just a straight port, with new soldier and vehicle types. And they asked about the joystick controls compared to mouse and keyboard. They say it's usable, a bit confusing at first if you're used to the PC version, but a good compromise. Dork. There's an info burst box giving the details. It's from Nintendo, a 128 megabits cart size, 1 or 2 players, no controller pack, expansion pack yes, rumble pack yes, transfer pack no. Release dates are June for the US, July for the UK, and TBA for Japan. Anticipation rating is 4 out of 5 of those little red planet things. They are clearly pretty hyped for this one. The captions in the screenshots are a bit sarcastic, saying Zerg equipment is grown and disturbing, and that the game was impressive at E3. Fingers crossed, eh? They say, showing they are not completely convinced it will work on the N64 pad. Overall, seems like a big push for StarCraft on the N64, trying to make a PC strategy game work on console, which was a bit of a gamble back then. This page is doing a special investigation into Stunt Racer 64. Seems they reckon it's got plenty of stunts and racing and is looking pretty promising. After being blown away by Ridge Racer 64, they didn't think much could top it, but Stunt Racer 64 has caught their attention. It's from Boss Games, the folks behind World Driver Championship and Top Gear Rally, so they must be doing something right. Apparently, it's all about car tinkering and over-the-top stunts. Looking at the screenshots, you can see some interesting track designs, and they even point out a rather disturbing gyrating inflatable doll on one track, which is a bit odd. They're showing off the turbo effect, which they say is pretty indeed. There's a shot highlighting the detail, even a clock in the background. They also mention a mesh-style section of track that's supposedly quite strong. In the info burst box, it tells us Midway is publishing it. It's a 128 megabit cart, for 1 to 4 players, supports controller and rumble packs but no expansion or Game Boy pack. It's due out in November in the UK and US, and Japan is still to be announced. Anticipation is pretty high. They've given it 4 out of 5 blobs. They even mention they travelled all the way to Washington in the USA to see Boss Games. Dedicated lads. Apparently, collecting coins lets you renovate your car, or even buy a new one. This page is all about a guided tour of the Medieval Mayhem course in Stunt Racer 64. Looks like they are taking us through the level step by step. Right at the start, point 1 says there's no turbo start, but you can boost once you get some speed up, which is standard racer stuff really. Retake. Then in point 2, they mention a massive castle looming after the initial straight, built right around the track, which sounds pretty typical for Stunt Racer 64. Everything is over the top in that game. Point 3 talks about the castle crumbling into a rotten wood and masonry section. Charming. Point 4, we're onto an icy stretch, and they're joking it's because of a blizzard-breathing dragon. Typical magazine humor back then. Point 5, Stunt Racer is full of vertical corners apparently, needing you to keep your speed up and stick to the center. Good advice for any racing game really. Point 6, thankfully there's a saying straight after a corner of doom. Dramatic wording as always. 7, more mythical beasts, this time a fire-breathing dragon that can knock you off course if you hit it. Sounds annoying but probably adds to the mayhem. Point 8, another castle, even more sinister than the first, with a gargoyle entrance hiding a steep drop. 9 talks about a X2 multiplier that doubles coin value to buy new cars, or upgrades classic arcade racer mechanic. 10, a bizarre passageway with ribs, avoid getting plucked from the track. And finally, 11, the rib corridor thins out to a wall of spikes on one side before the finish line. So basically, Medieval Mayhem in Stunt Racer 64 feet is full of castles, dragons, and dangerous track features. Sounds like a bit of a laugh, if you're into that kind of thing. This page has a feature called We Have the Technology, and it's all about Stunt Racer 64. It sounds like they are previewing the game and letting us know what to expect. Right, so unlike World Driver Championship, which was also on the N64, Stunt Racer 64 lets you mess around with your cars, which is good. Techie. First up, characters. Apparently at the start of the game you can pick from a bunch of weird human and wonderful alien characters. There's a picture of some of them. Toad, who is described as a human stand-up comedian, Des, who is a rocket scientist alien, and Trig, another alien who is powered car. Each character has their own car, and as you play, more characters and cars unlock, but if you pick a new character, you have to start in the first league again. Sounds a bit of a grind, but hopefully, it's worth it. Next, cash. While racing, you collect coins. They come in groups of 5 or more, and you can get multipliers to rack up the dollars quickly. You use this cash for upgrades and new cars. Bosses. Each league ends with a boss character who you have to race against. The first one is Kid Cola. Beat the boss, and you get their car. naturally. They call it imaginatively titled, Kid Cola's Car. Sarcasm, eh? Upgrades. Cash can also be used to upgrade your car's parts, body, engine, tires, battery, turbo, or stunt jet. Each bit gives you better performance. If you fully upgrade a car, it becomes available for others to buy. Neat, huh? Warranty. There's a section called Lifespan which says you win races and collect coins, and new cars can be bought and won from bosses. Sounds obvious, really. Then there's a bit called Missing Multiples. Apparently the 60% complete version of Stunt Racer they played didn't have multiplayer. Boss Games are trying to get 4-player working. World Driver Championship only had 2-player, remember that? They reckon they've got 3-player going with no slowdown or background detail loss, but 4 players proving tricky without an expansion pack. They'd be happy with a 4-player game even if it needs the extra memory pack. Well yeah, who wouldn't be? Nendok. The main article starts with, so, the N64 hasn't got any decent driving games, has it, Poppycock? Bit strong that. They mention World Driver Championship, Top Gear Rally 2, and Ridge Racer 64 and say Stunt Racer 64 looks stunning. They say it's a mix of Gran Turismo, San Francisco Rush, and F-Zero style track design. They mention negotiating loops, corkscrews and jumps, and say the controls are a bit too slippery slidey like World Driver Championship, but they are trying to sort that out. There's a little box that says you can easily hit twice that speed. Let's get RRRRAAACINGGGG. And it says the track design is futuristic and torturous. They want tighter turning, as at the moment it's hard to get around bends without crashing. Sounds like it could be a bit of a handful then. This page is all about Stunt Racer 64. Looks like they're calling it a real sweet visual treat. They're raving about the graphics, saying it's fast and smooth, and even manages to squeeze in background details from gyrating rabbits to fire-breathing dragons. Bit much maybe, but alright. There's talk about a high-res mode, which is good, though it sounds like it's got letterbox borders, which isn't ideal, but they say it still looks lovely. Replays are in, which is always a plus, although apparently, no fancy camera angles, a bit of a shame there. Boring to know. The gameplay section, James Stunt, mentions stunts are done with the analog stick, which is standard really. They're saying you can do ginormous jumps, and it's all about the stunt aspect. Apparently in the early version they played, the stunt stuff wasn't fully in, but it's going to be important for getting cash to upgrade your cars, or buy new ones, including a stunt jet. Sounds a bit daft. There's also a stunt arena mode, like in Snowboard Kids, or Wave Race they reckon. Then there's a turbo time section explaining the turbo boost, which uses a meter that refills over time, so you have to be a bit tactical with it, not just button mashing. They also mention the cars themselves, saying there's a few different ones from a police Superfuzz to a Batfin Desperado, and you can upgrade them. Apparently the damage isn't in yet, so cars are indestructible, but they say given the twisty tracks, it's probably a good thing. Tracks are tortuous and wildly inventive, like medieval madness, they say, whatever that means. Sounds a bit over the top. Right at the top in the League AL Eagles bit, it says Stunt Racer uses the World Driver engine, and it's structured like World Driver in leagues, but Stunt Racer 64 has 5 leagues. More than World Drivers 2, so more races and tracks. And finally, it says each race is first come, first served to get on the grid, so you have to be quick to buzz in. Overall, seems like they're quite impressed with Stunt Racer 64, especially the visuals and the stunt stuff, even if it was a bit early build when they looked at it. They think it's coming out near Christmas, looks like they'll have more on it in the coming months. Fair enough. This page is a special investigation piece, right, called Whatever Happened To. It's all about those N64 games that were announced, and looked pretty good at the time but then just vanished. In it, the article starts off by asking, remember Rika, which was supposed to be the UK's answer to Tomb Raider on the N64. Then there's Eternal Darkness, that spooky medieval sword game from Silicon Knights. And good old Conker 64, 12 Tales. The article mentions how all these games had official announcements, a few screenshots and then nothing. Silence. They're wondering where these games have gone. These would be blockbusters. The writer, donning their metaphorical Bogart-style trilby and overcoat, is going to investigate where these secretive games have ended up, and what we can expect in the run-up to Christmas 2000 for the N64. There's a picture there as well of a woman in a baseball cap holding a bat, looks a bit moody, with missing in action stamped over it, which kind of sums up the whole mystery, doesn't it? They're trying to find out what happened to these promising titles that just seem to disappear from the release schedules. Games like Mini Racers and Mother 3 are also briefly mentioned as having seemingly TBA release dates and then fading into obscurity. So, it's a bit of a detective job to see what became of them. This page is all about a couple of upcoming games, Conker's Bad Fur Day and Ringie. Conker's Bad Fur Day, blimey, what a turnaround they've done with that one. It was originally meant to be all sweet and innocent, you know, like Diddy Kong Racing, but now they're going completely the other way. Swearing, blood, and all sorts of adult humor. They're even mentioning stuff like a Saving Private Ryan parody and a dragon with, flaming flatulence, if you get my meaning. Sounds like they're really pushing the boundaries of what you could get away with on the N64, maybe even too far for some, eh? Still, it's certainly got people talking, hasn't it? Warrington. Then there's Regia. This one's been delayed a bit, apparently they needed to polish it up. It was originally pegged for a summer release, but now it's looking like November time. They managed to get some info out of Bit Studios about it, and it seems like you'll be fighting both humans and monsters, with guns and everything. Riga is the star, they say. Seems to be referring to the lady in the screenshot holding a gun. Looks a bit futuristic. They mention non-disclosure agreements, and Yamuchi's stare. Typical industry stuff, trying to keep everything secret. But they reckon if everything goes to plan we should see it in N64 Magazine 42, so we'll have to keep an eye out for that one then. There are some screenshots dotted around the page. For Conker, there's one of him with some massive bloke, and another with what look like weasels or stoats. And even one with a train engine character, no idea what that's about. For Rygie, there's just the one of the lady with the gun, stood next to what looks like a wire fence. No release date for either game just yet, but they're both looking interesting, in their own very different ways. This page delves into some upcoming N64 titles, kicking off with Super Mario Adventure. Remember that one? It was meant to be Japan's Super Mario RPG sequel, with a quirky 3D background and cardboard character style which we first saw at Space World. It sounds like it's still on track for release, though Nintendo was being a bit hush-hush about it. Apparently Princess Peach getting kidnapped again, surprise surprise, is central to the plot, and the characters are looking pretty lovable in that retro 2D style. They mention a combat system based on analog fiddling minigames and using items like boxing gloves and fire flowers. It seems like they're bringing back classic Mario baddies like Koopa Troopers and Goombas. They're even hinting at Kamek from Yoshi's Island on the SNES being the main villain again, which is a bit of a throwback. Next up is Mini Racers. This was supposed to be a Gran Turismo beta, a Micro Machines style RC car racer. It was originally rumored to come out in June but is now set for an August release over here. It's described as having tiny radio-controlled cars on twisty tracks, a bit like the classic RC Pro-Am on the NES. They were hyping up the track editor and hoping it would be better than Revolt. Micro Machinist style racing with a track editor sounds alright for a bit of multiplayer fun. Then there's Mother 3. This was the latest version of the N64's first proper RPG. It was unveiled at Space World with screenshots and story details, but since then, nothing. It had been in development for ages, even before the N64 was released, and was slated for May 2000. It got delayed again, naturally. The plot was said to be a bit odd, involving a cowboy and extraterrestrial visitors. They were betting on a December release, including a detail-drenched combat system. Bit of a strange mix, cowboy meets aliens, but Mother games were always a bit different, weren't they? After its success, DMA Design, who we now know as Rockstar North, confirmed they were working on an N64 version. But apparently, that's been canned. Bad news, sadly. However, the good news is, they are working on Grand Theft Auto for the Game Boy Advance, where you can ferry drugs, steal vehicles, and shoot coppers. They reckon it will arrive next autumn. They also suggest that because of the lower development costs of the Dolphin, which we now know as the GameCube, they might even create a Grand Theft Auto for that too. They end with a bit of sarcasm, saying, "Best include GTA Dolphin in your prayers as you kneel by your bed tonight." A bit cheeky, that last line. This page in the magazine is diving into some upcoming N64 titles, and it's a mixed bag as usual. In it, Chiyoyu. First up is Eternal Darkness. Remember that one? They showed a demo last year at E3, then radio silence. But now it seems it's back for this year's E3 in May. Developed by Silicon Knights, the team behind Blood Omen Legacy of Kain, apparently they're promising a medieval hack and slash with Resi 2 style camera angles. Bit of a strange mix, but could be interesting. They're banging on about fancy lighting and effects making for a spooky atmosphere, fighting skeletons and muscle-bound blokes. Sounds alright if a bit generic. They reckon it'll be out by autumn, we'll see about that. Magazine release dates are always a bit optimistic, aren't they? Hecka. Next, we've got Banjo-Tooie. Finally, a bit more on this. We've had a few screenshots dribbling out, but they've been keeping it very quiet on the Banjo-Kazooie sequel front. Now they've got a new screenshot for us at E3, and apparently it's going to have 8 levels, and Donkey Kong 64-style minigames. Kazooie can apparently get out of Banjo's backpack now as well, which is a new trick, and there's some mention of a dinosaur planet Link, which is interesting. Rare always had a few projects on the go at once. The reviewer reckons it looks a bit better than Banjo-Kazooie. Well, it should do, shouldn't it? It's the sequel. Then there's Mission Impossible 2. The first game, well, it wasn't exactly a classic, was it? But it sold a bucket load, so naturally, they're doing a sequel. This one's based on the John Woo movie, apparently, with Tom Cruise and Matrix-style special effects. Sounds a bit generic, doesn't it? Infogrames are having license issues, apparently, and it shifted to the Dolphin, which we now know is the GameCube. Apparently it was running on the N64 originally, but now it's using a PC graphics engine with voxel technology. Bit of a technical muddle, that. They're hoping to see if it's all true at E3, probably. Finally, in Crossing the Ocean, they're looking at some Japanese games. There's Pikachu VRS, where you can talk to Pikachu using a microphone plugged into the N64 controller. Christmassy gimmick for the kids, I suppose. Ogre Battle 64 is mentioned, complicated strategy RPG, been delayed due to translator problems, still in Japanese for now, due in August. Fighter's Destiny 2, despite early interest, doesn't sound like it's coming to the UK. You can import the Japanese version from another world though, they always have the imports. Same story with Snowboard Kids 2. Unlikely to travel outside of Japan officially, but another world can sort you out with the Japanese version, which is apparently similar to the first one. And lastly, Bomberman, The Second Attack. Apparently the single player is still rubbish, but the multiplayer is good, and it's got a retro look. More info on page 17 apparently. So, a bit of everything on this page really. This page is all about the Game Boy. Proper old school stuff now, isn't it? We're kicking off with Planet Game Boy, talking about how the humble Game Boy is still going strong even with all the fancy new consoles around. They're mentioning Zelda and Metal Gear Solid on the Game Boy, which at the time was pretty exciting, although looking back perhaps not quite the masterpieces of their console cousins. And Pokemon Pinball, blimey, they milked that franchise, didn't they? Apparently PlayStation games were getting the 8-bit treatment too, things like Pokemon Gold and Silver, Crash Bandicoot and Twisted Metal, which sounds a bit ambitious for the old Game Boy, but hey, anything for a quick buck back then. They also mentioned the Game Boy Advance coming soon and backwards compatibility, which was a relief, as we'd all built up a decent Game Boy library by then. Then there's a preview of Mini Driver. For the Game Boy, sounds like they're trying to do a Grand Theft Auto type game on the handheld. They say it's a stylized version, and the cities are lively, with car chases and criminal missions like ram-raiding restaurants and taxiing villains. Apparently it's got Micro Machines style handling, and is out in June. Sounds like a bit of fun on the go, if a little bit cheeky ripping off GTA like that. Worry. Lastly, there's a bit on Moomin Lovely, which is described as a cute platformer from Sunsoft, based on the Moomins. Apparently Moomin Troll is on a quest to cure Snork Maiden, with subquests and minigames involved. They reckon it's a nice game for younger players and should be out around May-ish. Moomins, bit saccharine for my tastes back then, but I suppose someone had to make games for the younger ones. It does look rather green and pleasant in the screenshots though, if you were into that kind of thing. This page is dedicated to a review of Metal Gear Solid on the Game Boy Color, and crikey, they've given it a full 5 stars. Essential purchase they reckon, and back then you know what, they weren't wrong. For a handheld it was pretty special. They're going on about how it's the best Game Boy Color game of the year, which, let's be honest, wasn't exactly a high bar to clear, but still, it was good. Talk about the gameplay, fixed guard patrols, alarms if you mess up, comparing it to Zelda, which, yeah, I suppose there's a bit of that sneaking around. Crawling to stay out of sight, infrared beams, poison gas, all the usual Metal Gear shenanigans. They rightly point out the graphics are a blend of 8-bit and PlayStation styles, which was a clever way to get around the limitations of the Game Boy. Bonus VR mode and Versus mode are mentioned too. £25 it was, which was a fair whack for a Game Boy game, but must-have they say, and yeah, fair enough. It's on page 37 of the magazine. This page is a review page, alright, kicking off with F1 Racing Championship for the Game Boy. Ubisoft, eh? Trying to bring the thrill of Formula 1 to the humble handheld. They reckon it's like those old 8-bit races, pole position and hang on. Remember those? Anyway, apparently this one's not bad for a Game Boy title. Better looking than you might expect, and with a decent arcade feel. They're banging on about pit stop options and courses that look like they nicked them straight from the telly coverage. Bit cheeky that. Cockpit view is decent too, and you even get wing mirrors. Fancy. There's some scenario mode where you can mess with F1 history, which sounds a bit of alright, technically good apparently, and they've even squeezed in some fancy full motion video, in color no less. 4 out of 5 stars they've given it. We'd be surprised if both cars escape without serious damage, they say, and Shuey starts from the back, which is a giggle. Then it's Tomb Raider time, Lara Croft on the Game Boy. Eidos are pushing this one out now, apparently. So PlayStation and Saturn's poster girl finally makes it to Nintendo's grey brick. They say it's nicked ideas from Prince of Persia, which, come on, who hasn't? Loads of animation, 2,000 frames apparently. Lara's got all her moves, leaps, climbs, backflips, the whole shebang. Cutscenes are supposed to be decent for the Game Boy too, like movie stills apparently. Gameplay is straightforward platforming, making those split-second jumps. Pistols are there, but shooting scorpions takes ages. Bit of a pain by the sounds of it. Still, mostly good platforming fun they reckon, and another 4 stars. Lara can shoot things while hanging on climbable walls, they point out, which is handy. Small jumps are harder than they look, don't get complacent. Good advice that. Impressive animation is the game's best feature. And something about a strange altar on level 1, and kill the scorpion. Right then, sounds like your typical Tomb Raider fare, but on the Game Boy. Fair enough. This page features a review section, kicking off with Wings of Fury for the Game Boy. They're calling it a conversion of an Amiga game and reckon it's a decent handheld shoot-'em-up, giving it a solid 4 out of 5. Seems they were surprised it was better than they expected, especially considering some of those Amiga levels were proper battery drainers back in the day. There are a couple of screenshots showing the plane bombing some targets, classic side-scrolling action. Next up is Rainbow Six, also on the Game Boy. They mention the N64 and PC versions being complex games, so they were surprised this handheld version worked as well as it did. They highlight the tactical planning aspect, picking your squad, equipping them, and setting waypoints, all before the action even starts. Apparently, in sniper mode the screen zooms in for a better view, which is neat for a Game Boy. They also gave this one a 4 out of 5, saying it's a rather impressive conversion, even if it's a bit fiddly on the smaller screen compared to the N64. Screenshots here show the planning screen, and some in-game action with characters clearing buildings. It's funny they mention you can shoot enemies in the back at any time, cheeky sods. Both games seem to be getting a thumbs up, good scores for Game Boy conversions. This page of the magazine is all about retro Game Boy games, proper handheld classics. First up is Wario Land, Mario Land 3. Apparently Wario was seen as Mario's scary alcoholic relative back then, which is a bit harsh, in it. They reckon it's excellent, full of Nintendo charm and humor, and more like Mario Land 2 than the weirder sequel, whatever that was supposed to mean, probably Wario Land 4 on the GBA, which wasn't even out yet. It talks about Wario collecting coins and shoulder-barging enemies, standard Wario stuff. Apparently hats give him powers, like turning into a dragon or getting wings. Sounds a bit bonkers, but alright. They've given it full marks, a 5 out of 5, so they clearly loved it. The screenshots show its classic Game Boy, proper monochrome, and there's some funny captions. Something about Wario looking yellow even in black and white, and he hits, he hoists, he chucks, he kills, which is a bit much, isn't it? And something about Wario in an Eric Morecambe moment. Who even remembers Eric Morecambe now, eh? Nah. Then underneath is Mole Mania. This was a puzzle game from '96. Another monochrome Game Boy job. You play a cool mole with sunglasses who's trying to save his family from a Mario lookalike bad guy. It's all about puzzle mazes and lateral thinking apparently, having to think about stuff above and below ground. They say if you can do the Guardian cryptic crossword you'll be alright with this one. Bit of a niche audience then. It got a 4 out of 5, so still pretty good. The screenshots have captions like, one special pair of cool shades, give the dinos some hot death action, and Mulsey can lift balls and roll them down the holes he makes. Sounds like a laugh, and they reckon there's something hidden under every screen. Sneaky. Both solid Game Boy titles, proper throwbacks. The next page is a proper mixed bag, covering a few different games with tips and high scores. Right at the top, it's Pokemon Pinball. Remember that one? Not out in the UK yet apparently, but imports were easy enough to get hold of. They are giving tips on special stages and how to catch Mew, saying you need to finish all 3 bonus stages twice, which sounds about right from what I recall. Then there's a bit on GTA, and a no clipping cheat for Vice City. Apparently if you find a building in central Banana Grove with steps, you can get onto the roof and become invincible, and fly around. Sounds like classic cheat code stuff back then, before the internet made everything instantly searchable. Then we've got Yoda Stories, with a list of passwords for different levels. Remember Yoda Stories on the Game Boy? Tough little adventure game that was. Passwords were a godsend back then. Level 2 is XKJ, level 3 GJP, and so on, all the way to level 15 with YSF. Handy for anyone still digging that one out. Tough lib then. Stranded Kids is next, with minigame locations. Take the big rock near the river for the fishing game, and the monkey to the big berry tree or north of the desert for other minigames. Stranded Kids, yeah, that was a quirky little game. Nay? Nay. Finally, there's the high score section. Pokemon pinball scores are dominated by Robbie Klein and Zamir Bandali, both for the red and blue tables. For Mario Deluxe Challenge Mode, James Holt from Halifax is top, and Phil Wakely from Exeter for Superplayer Mode. Tetris DX has Richard Ford from London racking up the points in 40 lines and marathon, with Alan McMenigal from Glasgow doing well in Ultra and Marathon Level 9. Game & Watch Gallery Donkey Kong has Jonathan Den from Stansted at the top, with a score of 9,999, and Mark via email is topping the Parachute and Chef scores. They are even asking for you to send in your own high scores to Planet Game Boy Magazine at their Bath address or email. Proper old school days of sharing scores in print. This page showcases the Game Boy Gallery section, which was always a bit of a laugh. It's all about showcasing snaps taken with the Game Boy camera, bless its blocky little heart. This time around it's themed, Mutate You So Much Right Now, which fits the slightly bizarre and often unintentionally weird pictures people manage to capture with that thing. The winner is a chap called Chris McGeown from County Armagh, who's got a self-portrait that they're calling Jez-like cranial shape with tusks. Right then. There are other submissions featured too, like Matthew Sexton who's messing with the mirror lens feature, Andrew Jeffrey's picture which is described as the state of that, and Robbie Jones from London who apparently took a picture after being battered, poor bloke. There's also a Pigman picture from Ruben Lodge, a rather cute cat from Dave Fry, and a Sesame Street-esque creation by Andrew Morris. Someone called James Brennan Craddock sent in a picture of what they think is Snorlax being hurt. Bit grim that. Further down there's some nice artwork from Rise Powell, a George Romero zombie-style picture from George Jackson, and a rather unflattering yuck gross picture from Simeon Schäuber. William Langford has made a thingy-bob, and Thomas Thompson has sent in their first ever review of something. It's obscured a bit. Looks like a dog and the word crap. Ouch. Finally, there's Joe Love trying to get Courtney's number, and some liberated cats in Holland, according to Matthew Hart. It's all a bit random and very Game Boy camera, really. They're even giving away a Game Boy Power Pack and wallet courtesy of Gamester as prizes, which back then was quite a decent haul for a bit of Game Boy camera tomfoolery. They're asking for more submissions, encouraging people to send in their freaks. Oh, the 90s, eh? This page is from N64 Arena, issue 41, and it's all about the latest UK N64 game reviews. Slap bang in the middle, you can't miss it, it's Pokemon Stadium. Big Blastoise taking center stage, looking a bit menacing to be honest. Battle your very own Pokemon in glorious 3D. On your N64, it proclaims. Remember the hype around seeing Pokemon in 3D? Madness. Menace. Then they've got a few other reviews lined up too. Daikatana, that was Kemco's first-person shooter, wasn't it? Is it any good, they ask? Well, that's the million-dollar question, wasn't it? Operation Winback, Koei's Stealth 'em Up, they're calling it. Trying to keep us entertained while we waited for Perfect Dark, which everyone was desperate for. Track and Field 2000, an update for that Olympic Button Basher series, good for a laugh with mates I suppose. Tony Hawk's Skateboarding, superb stunt action, apparently. That Tony Hawk game was a bit of a revelation at the time, changed skateboarding games forever. And then there's Custom Robo, described as a mechanical version of Pokemon. Bit of a stretch maybe, but sounds intriguing. Down at the bottom, Import Arena, reminding you about all the games the lucky sods in America and Japan were getting their hands on. Always a bit of a tease, that section, showing off all the stuff we couldn't easily get. Standard mag page layout, for the time, really. This page explains how N64 Magazine reviews games, laying out all the essential info. There's a section called Info Burst, which uses a made UP game called Metroid 64 inches to show what kind of details they give you. Things like cart size and player numbers. They talk about pluses and minuses, which is pretty standard for reviews, highlighting the good and bad points. Then there's an If You Like This section giving you game recommendations if you're into similar titles, using a fictional Mickey Mouse 64 inches as an example. A bit of a cheeky comparison there, suggesting it's like Mario but with Mickey Mouse. They mention a Gamers TV link and ITV's Gamers Show, suggesting you can catch one of the reviewers on telly, which was quite exciting back then. The How N64 Scores a Game section breaks down their percentage rating system. 85% and above gets a Star Game badge, that was the top tier. Then you have the brackets down to the disaster zone of 190%, described as absolute wretched crud, they didn't hold back. Finally, there's Team 64, introducing the magazine's reviewers. You've got Tim Weaver picking Winback as his game of the month, Will Overton going for Custom Robo that was a quirky one with buildable robots, Andrea Ball chose Pokemon Stadium, as did Justin Webb, Jess Bickham and Dark Mark. Martin Kitts went for Tony Hawk's, and Mark Green also picked Pokemon Stadium again. Looks like Pokemon Stadium was a popular choice amongst the team that month. And then there's Raichu, seemingly a mascot, with a funny quote about finding the trivialization of my species insulting. Bit of light-hearted fun to round it off. This page is from the N64 Arena section, looks like issue 41 of the magazine. It's all about Pokemon Stadium. They're showing off some screenshots, classic N64 era 3D models, with Charizard looking a bit chunky, coughing happily poisoning things, Butterfree flapping around, and Meowth getting ready to scratch someone's face off. There's an info burst box that's got the lowdown on Pokemon Stadium. Cart size was a hefty 256 megabits back then. You could get up to 4 players battling it out, which was always a laugh with your mates. It mentions controller pack AC, cartridge save, password save, all the save options in those days. Then there's expansion and rumble pack AC being a no-go, but transfer pack AC is a yes. That was the key bit for bringing your Pokemon over from the Game Boy games. It was out right now in the UK, US and Japan and costing £50, which was a fair whack for a game at the time. Stay Games. The article itself is titled Pika Pikachu. Hey, that's fighting talk, you little monster. They're saying Pokemon is great, but even proper Pokemon fans had to admit the Game Boy battles were a bit basic. Tiny screen and all that. They reckon Stadium makes it all much better. Battles on the big telly, in color 3D. They mention the transfer pack again, letting you use your own Pokemon, and how it's a dream come true for trainers to see these battles in proper stadiums. They're asking if these monster battles will keep your attention, and hinting the next few pages will give us the answer, so looks like a bit of a preview then. The next page focuses on Pokemon Stadium for the N64. It's got a big, bold title just saying Stadium. This was a pretty anticipated game back then, promising to bring your Game Boy Pokemon teams into 3D on the telly, mind you. We already had Pokemon Stadium in Japan before this one, and that one only had about 60 odd monsters, but this European version it's the full whack of 151, Mew and all. The screenshots show off some battles. Vulpix spitting flames, Bulbasaur squaring off, Tauros running like a loony, and Nidoking looking a bit grumpy. They're making a point about the 3D models, saying they're all animated nicely, even the blinking eyes, which was quite a step up from the Game Boy sprites at the time, wasn't it? There's also shots of Jolteon, Vileplume, Beedrill and Hypno, showing off a range of Pokemon. The text also mentions using a Thunderstone on Eevee to get Jolteon, which was classic Pokemon stuff, everyone knew that. They reckon Hypno is one of their favourite Pokemon, but admit he's a bit of a weirdo, which is fair enough. He is a bit creepy looking, isn't he? All in all, it's a preview hyping up Pokemon Stadium, reminding us we can finally see our pocket monsters battling it out in glorious, albeit blocky, 3D. This page is all about getting your hard-earned Pokemon from the Game Boy games Red and Blue onto Pokemon Stadium on the N64. Right, so back then, if you wanted to really show off your Pokemon team, you couldn't just rely on the rental Pokemon in Stadium. You needed to bring in your own trained monsters from the Game Boy. It's split into 2 parts. Catch 'em and transfer 'em. Catch 'em is basically telling you to play your red or blue version, make sure you've caught some Pokemon in Viridian Forest and saved at a Poke Center. Fairly obvious stuff if you actually owned the games. Then transfer 'em gets into the nitty-gritty. You had to use the transfer pack, that clunky thing you plugged into your N64 controller. You slotted your Game Boy cart in there, turned on the N64, and boom, Pokemon Stadium could read your save file. Professor Oak's lab in Stadium was your portal to your Game Boy Pokemon boxes. You could move them around, and importantly, register a battle team of 6. They are pushing the anything goes battle rule, probably because those rental Pokemon in Stadium weren't exactly top tier. It's all about using your own, leveled up beasts, naturally. It was pretty cool at the time. Seeing your little Game Boy sprites blown up on the big telly in glorious, well, N64 graphics anyway, definitely gave you a bit more ownership of your Pokemon battles, rather than just relying on the game's pre-made stuff. Bit fiddly with the transfer pack, but worth it for bragging rights, I suppose. The next page delves into the exciting world of Pokemon Stadium on the N64, under the title, Fight 'em. It seems to be a guide or walkthrough for a particular battle mode. It starts by introducing the 2 battling teams. Player 1's team, which includes a level 5 Pikachu, humorously described as a freshly caught bunch, and Player 2's team of level 50 plus monstrosities. Right? Cheeky. The page explains that in Anything Goes battles, you can use all 6 of your Pokemon, unlike the usual 3. It then shows a screenshot of the Pokemon selection screen, featuring classic monsters like Psyduck, Execute, Grimer, Doduo, Tentacool and Pikachu for Player 1, and Magikarp, Nidoking, Tentacool, Parasaias, Wartortle and Poliwrath for Player 2. Looks like Player 1 is in for a rough time against those beefed up level 50s, bless 'em. Next we see the battle starting with Player 1's Psyduck going up against Player 2's Nidorina, described as a fairly evenly balanced match. The C buttons are highlighted as a quick way to access your Pokemon's moves, a pretty handy feature in the heat of battle. The guide then mentions Nidorina's speed trumping Psyduck's, meaning she gets to attack first. Unluckily for Psyduck, it's hit with a water-type move which is super effective, poor sod. And just like that, Psyduck is down and out in one turn. Player 1 has to pick another Pokemon, Jockey. The action moves on to Pikachu versus Poliwrath. Apparently, a few rounds later, Pikachu has weakened Poliwrath with Tentacool's help. Tentacool got one attack in, before being knocked out by Poliwrath's Bubble Beam. Now it's Player 1's Tentacool versus Poliwrath, and then Grimer versus Poliwrath. Even though Grimer is an oil-based monster, whatever that means, right? It's seriously injured by Poliwrath. Monstra. Finally, it's Doduo against Poliwrath. Low HP means Doduo is practically done for, only needing one more Bubble Beam from Poliwrath to finish it off. And bang, Doduo is defeated in one shot by Poliwrath's Bubble Beam. Player 2 wins the battle. So there you have it, a quick Pokemon Stadium battle report. Good times. This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at Pokemon Stadium. It's all about the Stadium mode, which is the single-player side of things. They're saying there's a load of cups to win, 16 in total, split across 4 main cups like Petite Cup, Pika Cup, Poké Cup, and Prime Cup. Each cup's got 8 battles, so it'll take a fair bit of time to win them all, apparently weeks, and you need to get all 8 badges in the Game Boy game before you can even think about properly competing, which is fair enough. Then there's Professor Oak's lab. This is quite a bit of a step up from the Game Boy games, moving into proper 3D for the menus and stuff. The lists section is talking about the new PC system in the game. It's supposed to be much better organized than the old boxes on the Game Boy, with color-coded tables, and easier to sort your Pokemon. They reckon it's dead simple to use even if you've got the transfer pack plugged in, which you would need for all this to really work. Next up is the map, a fancy 3D color map of Pokemon Island. They're saying it's way better than the old black and white job on the Game Boy, showing all the Pokemon nests and details like hills and rivers. You could even overlay the original Game Boy map on top of it if you were feeling nostalgic, which is a bit of a laugh. The Pokédex section is all about the 3D renders of the 151 Pokemon. You can look at them in detail, arrange them by name or number, and get a paragraph of info on each one. It even shows you what sound they make, apparently. A nice touch, I suppose. Finally, the transfers bit talks about moving Pokemon and items over from your Game Boy games using the transfer pack. It's the main point of the game, really, battling your properly trained Pokemon in 3D on the telly. They mention you can set up your party manually before each battle, which is useful for tweaking your team. So it's all looking pretty comprehensive for managing your Pokemon and getting stuck into stadium battles. This page is all about Pokemon Stadium and some of the, shall we say, more interesting moves you could pull off in that game. It's titled Monster Mash, and reckons it's showing off 8 of the greatest Pokemon abilities. Bit of a stretch maybe, but alright, boring. They've got sections on Hyper Beam, Dream Eater, Bubble Beam, Rage, Hypnotic, Alter, Confusion, and Earthquake. For each one, they give a little description and a screenshot from the game. Hyper Beam, for example, is Dugtrio's speciality, and apparently drains HP to 0 in seconds. Dramatic stuff. Dream Eater with Hypno, Bubble Beam looking particularly effective against rock types, and Rage always a bit of a wildcard, that one. Hypnotic is supposed to paralyze, Alter, well, Porygon is using it, so who knows what's going on there. Confusion is just classic slapstick, and Earthquake, naturally, is described as devastatingly powerful. Then there's another bit underneath called No Pain Some Gain, which is talking about status moves in Stadium. They are making a point that moves like Sleep, Hypnotic, and Sing, even Jigglypuff's Sing, can let you unleash powerful attacks without taking damage. They mention Freezer too, for a bit of that debilitating ice. It's all about tactical battling, using status effects to your advantage. They've got a couple more screenshots showing Confusion in action, and a Pokemon being altered by status effects. Pokemon Stadium was a big deal back then, wasn't it? Seeing your Pokemon battles in proper 3D after all those Game Boy years was quite the jump. Good times. This page dives into Pokemon Stadium, specifically the Pokemon Castle mode. It's pitched as an alternative to the Stadium mode, and the reviewer is clearly amused by the idea of facing the gym leaders and Elite Four again in this format. They make a cheeky comment about bad news for anyone thinking they'd escaped Lieutenant Surgeon Brock after Red and Blue, suggesting this mode is going to be just as challenging. There are screenshots showing battles against Aerodactyl and Nidoking, and another one featuring Graveler. The text highlights Aerodactyl's speed, a well-known trait even back then. Below that, there's a section called Kids Club, detailing some Mario Party-style minigames within Pokemon Stadium. They mention Run, Rattata Run, a race with Rattatas jumping fences, Dig, 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 a Sandshrew digging competition, Eakin's Hoop Hurl, which sounds like throwing Eakin's rings onto Diglets, and Sushi Go Round, where Lickitung eats sushi. The reviewer adds little comments about each minigame, noting the camera messing with you in Run, Rattata, Run, and some dark humor about exploiting Pokemon in Eakin's Hoop Hurl. Sushi Go Round gets a funny mention about a Lickitung turning tomato-colored after eating pepper sushi. It's all pretty standard minigame fare for the time, trying to cash in on the Mario Party craze. This page is all about Pokemon types in Pokemon Stadium. They've called it Typing Class. Right, so they are explaining how type matchups work, like a rock paper scissors thing but with 15 different types. Bit much for some people back then, I reckon. They kick off with water types, mentioning Surf and showing off Squirtle and Gyarados, plus Poliwhirl and Kingler doing their thing. They're banging on about water being good against fire, obviously. Then it's rock types, Geodude and Graveler, saying they're all about brute force and good against, well, who knows at this rate, it's a bit of a wheel. Flying types are next. Pidgey gets a mention. Everyone knows about Pidgey from the Game Boy games, and apparently winged attacks are frighteners. Righto, Roarinsoso. Bug types are up, calling them the weakest, bit harsh. Butterfree is there to represent. Psychic types are deadly. Apparently most types have no effect on them, and Hypno and Butterfree are demonstrating. Fighting types, Hitmonchan and Hitmonlee, all about strength and kicking and punching. Ice is next with Articuno, a rare bird, saying it freezes living cells bit grim. Grass types are described with Bulbasaur, dopey Bulbasaur they say. Apparently they suck the life out of things, plant roots and all that. Ground types are Dugtrio and Dragonite battling, earthquakes and such, specifically against Tay-A, who knows. Electric is last. Pikachu of course, they say only ground attacks are good against it, electric Pokemon are best at attacking. It's a whirlwind tour of Pokemon types really, for anyone still struggling with the basics back in the year 2000. This page focuses on multiplayer in Pokemon Stadium, which was always a laugh with mates. It's titled Friendly Fire, which is a bit of a pun, considering it's Pokemon battles. They're running through the different battle types you could get stuck into. First up is Free Battle, the standard stuff. But they point out you can mess with the rules to make things more interesting, like limiting the Pokemon types or levels, to stop everyone just spamming Mewtwo. Cheeky. Then there's Event Battle, which sounds like a more structured two-player fight, with preset cup rules and time limits which could get tense. They mention having to plan tactics when choosing your 3 Pokemon out of 6, which was always the brainy bit. Preset cup. Tag Team Battle is for 3 or 4 players, or you and some computer players, teaming up Pokemon. They highlight the Anything Goes rules where you could have a level 7 Clefairy facing a level 100 Mewtwo, which is just bonkers, but that's the fun of it. The page also touches on another level, literally, talking about how Pokemon strength is based on levels. They point out level 1 Pokemon are rubbish and only know one move, which is fair enough. They mention leveling up through the Game Boy games and then bringing them over to Stadium, which was the whole point really, battling your properly trained team in glorious 3D gay. There are captions too, one about a SELFDESTRUCT rule preventing cheap wins, another about Bulbasaur getting blasted by a Vulpix, and one making a funny comment about a Charmander looking a bit silly. There's also a tip that unless your Pokemon are level 100 you won't last in the Prime Cup, which is probably true, and another saying rental Pokemon are level 50 or 100 depending on the cup. Good to know. Overall, it's a pretty solid look at the multiplayer side of Pokemon Stadium, reminding you why it was so good for getting your mates around for a battle tournament. This page is diving into the world of Pokemon Stadium, and blimey, it's a looker, isn't it? First up, there's a bit called Death Becomes Them, a tad dramatic, even for Pokemon. They're on about the fainting animations, and how much effort they've put into them. Apparently when your Pokemon gets knocked out, it's not just a simple flop, oh no, Bulbasaur here sways about before going down, and Farfetch'd makes a right meal of it, desperately grabbing for his leek, bless him. Even Squirtle gets the sparkly treatment, and they reckon it's all to do with magical Pokeballs. Right then, moving on, we've got Dream Machines, which isn't about inventing teleportation, sadly. It's about TMs and HMs from the Game Boy Pokemon games, Red and Blue. Apparently these things are like teachable moves for your Pokemon, and in Stadium you can actually sort through your TM and HM stock on the big screen, which back in the day was a right treat compared to faffing about on that tiny Game Boy screen. They're showing off a Machamp and a Wartortle, looking quite the pair. They say TMs are usually attacking moves, but HMs help you get around in the Game Boy games, like Scooty, for chopping down trees. Handy stuff. Lastly, there's Trade Away, and this is about trading Pokemon between Red/Blue and Stadium. You plug your transfer packs and Game Boy carts into your controllers, head to Professor Oak's Plaza, and away you go. You can actually watch your Pokemon being traded on the telly, which is a bit of a novelty. And get this, Pokemon might even evolve during the trade, like Graveler turning into Golem Magic. They've got an example of Will swapping his Charmander for an Execute. Bit of an odd trade if you ask me. Charmander's way cooler, but each to their own. They even show the 3D models of the Pokemon departing during the trade. Fancy that. And apparently it's all easy peasy, 123, with your Game Boy cart. So there you have it, Pokemon Stadium, showing off its fancy graphics and clever features for us Pokemon trainers. The next page is all about the Vision On feature in Pokemon Stadium. It's a bit of a gimmick really, but back in the day, anything Pokemon related was like gold dust, wasn't it? This feature is basically a slimmed-down Pokemon Snap for European and US versions of Pokemon Stadium. It walks you through 4 simple steps. First, you pick a Pokemon from the rentals, and they rightly point out it's much better to use your own Pokemon if you've got them from the Game Boy games. Then, disappointingly, the Pokemon just jumps or wiggles, not exactly dynamic. You can move the camera around while it's posing though. Step 3, you save your snaps in a photo album. Finally, step 4 is the really retro bit. You could actually print these pictures out as stickers at Blockbuster video stores. Remember Blockbuster? Madness! The page also has a section called Visuals, talking about how good the Pokemon animations are in Stadium. They mention how the Pokemon bounce around and pose, waiting for your next command, and how this adds to the charm. They say it's a surefire recipe for love, which is a bit strong, but yeah, it was cool seeing the Pokemon in 3D like that. They do moan a bit about the commentator being boring, and the length of time some moves take to play out, which is fair enough. Overall, it's a look at the Pokemon Stadium photo mode, and the game's visuals, played up for all it's worth. The next page is all about Pokemon Stadium on the N64. Right then, Pokemon Stadium came out when Pokemon was absolutely massive here, everyone was mad for it. This review here reckons it's a 90% score, blimey. They're showing off screenshots of battles. You got your Machamp, Sheller using some electric move, Pikachu looking charged up. There's also a Cubone smashing a Clefairy. Bit harsh that. They're even showing off a triple-headed Dodrio, which they've called a Jess Monster for some reason, and given it funky green leaves. Bit weird, but alright. The review is split into pluses and minuses. Pluses are gripping battles, flawless animation, stacks of cups and minigames, and it's enjoyable with friends. Minuses are worst in-game commentator, and that you pretty much need Pokemon Red or Blue to get the most out of it. That last bit is a fair point, bit cheeky if you didn't have a Game Boy and a copy of Red or Blue already, isn't it, to get the full experience. They suggest if you like this you'll like Mario Party, which is fair enough, both good for multiplayer laughs. They bang on about the visuals being great, the Pokemon looking alive, and the animation being jaw-dropping. Bit strong maybe, but it did look decent for the time. Sounds get a bit of a kicking though, apparently no proper Pokemon calls, and the voiceover is annoying. Mastery is about how well they've used the transfer paddock, which was quite clever I suppose, being able to bring your Pokemon from the Game Boy games into 3D battles. Lifespan, they reckon it'll last for ages if you're into your Pokemon battles, and that special effects explosion of the N64 fights will last years. Bit much, but it was a fun game for a while, especially with your mates. Overall verdict, they're calling it consistently thrilling and a flawless demonstration of the transfer pack's potential. So yeah, pretty positive review really. This page is all about Daikatana, remember that one? Massive hype surrounding it back then, being a John Romero game after all, but it didn't quite live up to it, did it? The article is questioning if it can fill the space left by Perfect Dark, which, let's be honest, is a very big space to fill. There are screenshots showing off bits of gameplay, a Discus of Daedalus, which they call an ornamental plate, sounds sarcastic, and a shockwave gun which they say is very pretty. There's another bit about Dark Ages Norway being used in the game, and some 21st century kill peasants dead. Bit dramatic. They mention needing a key for a gate, and comment that monster design isn't terribly inspiring, which is a polite way of saying they look a bit naff. Grenade launchers are mentioned as good fun, which is always a plus. Apparently in Greece the level is pretty, but a little bit empty. And you get sidekicks, but they're not much help, typical AI companions back then. Down the side, there's an info burst box detailing Daikatana. It's from Kemco. 128 megabit cart. 1 to 4 players. It says controller pack needs 3 pages, rumble pack is ticked but no cartridge save, password save, expansion pack or transfer pack. Release dates are April for both US and UK, and TBA for Japan, costing £40. So yeah, Daikatana, big promises, let's see if it delivers was the vibe. This page is all about Daikatana, which, let's be honest, had a lot of hype surrounding it back in the day. It kicks off by describing the game's plot. You're bouncing through time to different locations like ancient Greece and Dark Ages Norway, all to get to San Francisco and face your nemesis. Apparently the Daikatana sword itself is your time travel ticket. Ancient Greece in the game is described as foggy, and you'll be dealing with Sharon the boatman and Medusa. Dark Ages Norway sounds a bit grim with plague, zombies and evil wizards chucked in for good measure. The reviewer mentions the cutscenes in Norway are supposedly hilarious, which could be good or bad, depending on your sense of humor. Then there's a section on the weapons, which they reckon are the lifeblood of any first-person shooter. They list a few, like the Shot Cycler, which is a powerful but slow shotgun with rubbish reload animation, the Sidewinder rocket launcher, C4 Visiturgo grenades, and the Trident of Poseidon, which is a bit silly but powerful against dead things. There's also the ballista weapon and a hammer that creates a shockwave. Sounds like your typical over-the-top shooter arsenal, doesn't it? Tower. Multiplayer gets a mention. Apparently it's 4-player, but they say it's a bit slow and there aren't many levels, which isn't ideal. They reckon it's not the greatest multiplayer ever, and it's a shame as Perfect Dark is just around the corner. That was the game everyone was waiting for multiplayer-wise back then. Words of Wisdom talks about the cutscenes, saying they're basic and not a patch on GoldenEye or Jet Force Gemini, and that the translation is awful. They even quote a bit of dodgy dialogue about a power glove being called a power grove. Classic. The page also talks about the history of Daikatana, mentioning John Romero, who was behind Doom and Quake. He jumped ship to form Ion Storm, and started work on Daikatana. Apparently it took Romero over 3 years, the same time it took Miyamoto to finish Zelda. Quite the comparison, eh? They also mention John Carmack's brother, who worked on Doom and Quake, also had a hand in Daikatana and Quake Arena. They seem to think it's impressive that the N64 version is out before the PC one. The reviewer concludes that Daikatana tries to mix RPG elements with first-person shooter action, but reckons the N64 conversion is just a simplified port of the PC original, and the levels and textures are a bit bland. They do say Kemco's game has beaten expectations though. This page is all about Daikatana, remember that one? Crikey, it was hyped to hell and back, wasn't it? This is a how-to guide on grabbing the Daikatana sword itself in the game. Turns out you can't actually properly use it, cheeky. They've given it a 67% verdict, which, looking back, feels about right. It was a bit of a letdown after all the fuss. They've broken down the pluses and minuses. On the plus side, they reckon the levels are set in different time zones, there are loads of meaty weapons, it's pretty fast, and the controls are tight. They even mention intriguing RPG-style extras, whatever they were. The minuses? Dull and stupid monsters, small levels, basic puzzles, drab, and apparently some of the guns are quite absurd. Sounds about right again, doesn't it? If you were into Quake 2 back then, they're saying you might like this. Quake 2, on the N64, remember that? Solid port that was. They gave that a 90% back in the day in this very mag, calling it straightforward single player, and a multiplayer to die for. Visually they say Daikatana's textures are simple and slightly muddy, but the time zones are different, which is something I suppose. Sound-wise, guns, half-hearted screams and terrible music. Ouch. Mastery is apparently fairly basic, but clips along at a fair old rate, and lifespan is. Single player isn't huge and the multiplayer is basic and slow. Usati. The verdict sums it up really. Daikatana tried to do something different but was just a very average first-person shooter in the end. They even mention the usual key stupendador puzzles, and not much else to tax the brain. They reckon it's below the level of games like Turok, Duke Nukem and GoldenEye. And even Perfect Dark, which was just around the corner at the time. Strong words. Still, everyone wanted to see what John Romero was up to after Doom and Quake, didn't they? Shame it didn't quite live up to the hype, eh? This page is about Operation Winback, or as the Americans called it, Winback, Covert Operations. It's a review from issue 41 of N64 Magazine, going back to issue 35 where they reviewed the US version. Seems like they liked it then, calling it tip-top shooting spiffery. The page has some screenshots, typical N64 blocky graphics, but, you know, it was what it was back then. They're pointing out things like headshots, and dodgy enemy AI where you can just dodge bullets. Classic stuff. There's also a bit about the language being a bit naughty, and our hero Jean-Luc, bless him, not understanding what tragots means, which is a bit of humor I suppose. They mention the story, something about some bloke called Kenneth, and his motley crew of social inadequates, stealing a satellite, and holding the world to ransom. Bit over the top as usual for these sorts of games. They're calling it a stealth shooter from Koei, and it's out now in the US and Japan, and coming to us Brits in April for £40. The infoburst box gives you the usual stats. Virgin are publishing, 128 megabits cart, 1 to 4 players, needs 9 pages on your controller pack, no cartridge or password save, no expansion pack or transfer pack, but Rumble pack is go. So yeah, looks like Operation Winback, same game, different name, same great game according to them. We'll see about that when it finally hits our shores in April. This page in N64 Magazine is diving into the multiplayer and training modes of Winback. Right, so Winback, that was that Konami shooter, wasn't it? Came out a bit later in the N64's life. Anyway, they're calling the multiplayer section Arena, and it's got 6 different game types for when you've got mates over. Deathmatch is your standard one life only affair, classic stuff, be careful where you tread and all that. Point match is points based, bit more strategic, and lethal tag sounds like King of the Hill, but you get points for staying on top, score 7 points and you win. Then there's Cube Hunt, which they compare to Beetle Adventure Racing, which is an odd comparison but okay. You collect cubes but lose them when you get hit, sounds a bit daft. Quick Draw is more cube based madness, but this time you shoot them. Knowing where they pop up is half the battle, apparently. And finally, Team Battle, a slightly longer deathmatch with character selection. There's 28 characters to pick from apparently, which is a fair few. Below that, they're on about the training mode. They call it Training Arena, and it's split into beginner, intermediate and advanced sections to teach you the ropes. Beginner is pistol skills at the firing range. Sounds basic enough, learn to roll and duck. Intermediate throws in crates and makes it harder, you'll need to use cover. Advanced is where things get serious, you are facing proper combat training, and they say it's a taster of what to expect from the bosses later in the game. There's a screenshot of a bloke called Steve mouthing off, telling you've got to beat me. Right then, Steve. This page is taking a look at Winback, or Operation Failed as they've gone with for the title here, and it seems to be a bit of a mission briefing gone wrong kind of scenario. They're walking you through a bit of gameplay, highlighting how it's easy to muck things up. It kicks off talking about being careful in dimly lit areas, and hints at enemies lurking. Then it mentions firing in bursts to conserve ammo and maximize damage, which is standard stuff for these types of games. In it, they point out secondary attacks from different angles being tricky to deal with, so it sounds like they're ramping up the challenge a bit. There's a bit about escaping an ambush, and ending up in a complex that's apparently like GoldenEye's facility, and you need to stay hidden. Then, predictably, a guard has to be taken out, but they say the shots won't alert others if you're lucky. Famous last words in any game, eh? It then seems to go wrong, with a black-clad terrorist elite showing up, and then the player character, Jean-Luc, getting taken down by a super soldier after getting a few shots in himself. Back to the start then, as usual. The review box highlights the tense sneaking parts, and then the sudden action bits, referring to buttock-clenching moments when enemies pop out quite dramatic. They reckon it's like being in a Hollywood gunfight, mentioning Butch and Sundance and High Plains Drifter. Bit dramatic again, aren't they? And then 21 Jump Streak gets a mention for some reason, bit of a weird reference. The verdict is pretty positive, saying it should satisfy shoot-'em-up fans, especially if you like GoldenEye or Siphon Filter. They talk about firing from cover, all hell breaking loose, and that being the gist of it with laser traps and switch pulling. They even compare it to Metal Gear Solid and say Winback expands on the idea. Sounds like they reckon it's a decent game for those wanting a bit of strategic shooting in their life. You know, disposing of platoons of enemy grunts. They say it's simple gameplay-wise, but with surprising twists depending on how well you do. Could have done with more variety and puzzles apparently, but overall, good for fans of GoldenEye and Siphon Filter. So, if you were after something similar to those games on the N64, Winback sounds like it could be worth a punt. This page covers Operation Winback, remember that one? It was supposed to be a bit like GoldenEye but perhaps a bit more tactical. The page highlights the Gundam sections, which they reckon are tough due to fixed gun placements, but say it's fun to turn the tables and use them against the enemy. Then there's the boss-sized headache section talking about the bosses, saying they appear regularly and are proper bullet sponges. They describe the boss encounters having a bit of build-up with big empty rooms, which I suppose was meant to be dramatic at the time. The pluses and minuses bit is pretty standard review stuff. Pluses are scarily realistic shooting, brilliant combat system, good multiplayer, and atmospheric buildings. Minuses are duff camera, foggy graphics, and no blood. Yeah, the camera in Winback was a bit of a nightmare from what I recall, and the fog was N64 standard, to hide the draw distance limitations. No blood, probably aimed for a lower age rating. Perhaps a bit tame for some. If you like this, section suggests GoldenEye 007, which is a fair shout. Everyone was trying to be GoldenEye back then, weren't they? They say it's similar, but with more variety, which is probably true. Winback was maybe a bit samey after a while. Adult. The review scores each category. Visuals gets a 7, noting the fuzziness and fog but praising character models, which were decent enough for the time. Sounds get an 8, saying they are functional and atmospheric, and shots sound deadly. Mastery gets a 7, again pointing out the dodgy camera and fog. Lifespan gets an 8, mentioning multiplayer and time trial modes adding replayability. The verdict sums it up as great stuff with just a few reservations, and gives it an 83%. They even compare it to a .44 Magnum for feeling like Clint Eastwood. Bit dramatic, isn't it? Overall it sounds like they thought it was alright. Good, but not amazing, which is probably how most people remember Winback. There's a few screenshots dotted around showing in-game action, and a boss character called Duke, who they describe as having a blonde crew cut and big muscles, very descriptive. They even joke about having seen him before. The mastery section at the bottom reiterates the camera being the main problem, saying it's too dumb and spoils the game, which echoes what they said in the minuses section. This page is all about International Track and Field 2000. Seems like they took a quick look at it in the previous issue, number 40, and now they are giving us a bit more. It's got that classic button bashing gameplay they are talking about, saying it's a tiring exercise, no kidding. They mention using autofire, but it's a bit of a cheat, isn't it? Apparently rubbing a Velcro wallet on the buttons is the pro technique. Beautiful, they say. Beautiful, they say. There are a few screenshots showing the hurdling and the long jump, classic events really. Looks alright graphically for the N64, nothing mind-blowing but does the job. They've got an info burst box with all the details. Konami are behind it. 128 megabit cart size, which is decent. Up to 4 players can hammer those buttons. And it uses 20 pages on the controller pack to save your records. No cartridge save, password or expansion or transfer packs. Rumble pack is in though, good for feeling those virtual muscles ache. Says it's out in late April, and will set you back £40. Seems a fair price for a bit of Olympic action. They reckon the replays are alright for checking your accuracy and timing, which is handy when you are trying to perfect your button bashing. Long jump is apparently a favourite of theirs. Top stuff indeed. Sounds like a bit of harmless fun if you don't mind destroying your controller buttons. This page then, it's all about International Track and Field 2000 on the N64. They've got a step-by-step guide to the pole vault. Looks a bit fiddly with all the timing and button bashing. There's a section called Pado Evil about some dodgy third-party controller they slated in issue 40. Apparently it's so rubbish it's actually alright for the hammer throw event in this game. Who'd have thought? Down at the bottom they're saying it's a proper workout for your thumbs, exhausting after just a few minutes, but a laugh with your mates in multiplayer. And there's a picture of some bloke from the game, looks like he's really putting in the effort. This page is all about Konami's International Track and Field 2000 on the N64. It's a how we do it guide, focusing on the horizontal bar event, bit of a tricky one if you remember. They're walking you through the controls, step by step with pictures. First your gymnast just gets on the bar automatically. Then you've got to time your button presses using the Z trigger. When a command strip appears, bit fiddly that was. Get it right, and you get analog stick directions to follow, flashing up quickly to execute a move and rack up points. It mentions the point scoring is based on the number of moves you successfully pull off. And at the end, your gymnast dismounts, and that's your score tallied. Better luck next time if you mess it up, eh? The writer reckons it's all incredibly simple stuff to pick up, just various button combinations. They say it's proper addictive, comparing it to time trialing on Mario Kart but tiring after a while. They mention other events in the game too, like the 100 meters sprint, hammer, javelin, hurdles, and even weightlifting. A good mix of Olympic sports in it. They seem pretty impressed, saying Konami have improved on the PlayStation version and that it's going to be popular. They do joke about the weightlifting being a bit of a clunker though. Not all events are winners, I suppose. This page is all about International Track and Field 2000, dubbed Heaven Event, a bit dramatic in it. It's a rundown of the best and worst events in the game. Trap shooting is marked as most fun. Apparently blasting clay pigeons is a right laugh. Weightlifting is most difficult. And they're not wrong, those button combos could be a proper pain. 100 meters freestyle is most tiring, which sounds about right for a button bashing swimming event. Breaststroke is most boring. Well, someone had to be last. Hammer throw is most pad-knacking, which is a fair cop. Spinning that analog stick like a lunatic could give you blisters. Finally, javelin is most satisfying. Nailing that 46-degree angle for a record throw is apparently the bee's knees. They've got a pluses and minuses bit, like they always do. Pluses are great visuals, action replays, some superb challenges, and tremendous fun with friends. Minuses are samey in places, not so fun on your own, exhausting, and pad wearing, which is basically controller destroying in gamerspeak. If you like this, they say Mario Party, which is a fair shout. Both are party games for a laugh with mates. Mario Party on the N64, now that was a proper game back then, 85% they gave it, decent score. Yo, the verdict gives International Track and Field 2000 a solid 86% and a Star Game Award. They say it's basic but fun, especially with mates, but single player is a bit lacking. Replays are apparently brilliant and detailed, which is a nice touch. Good old Konami, churning out these arcade sports games, they were a staple back in the day, weren't they? May 2000, time flies. This page is all about Tony Hawk's skateboarding for the N64. Right then, so they're saying the expansion pack doesn't really make a difference. Cheeky. Apparently there might be a longer replay mode with it, but they couldn't even tell the difference visually on a standard N64. So don't bother basically if you haven't got one, or so they say. Eaton Norks. They've got these modes detailed. Horse, Graffiti and Trick Attack. Horse is your classic trick-for-trick mode to spell horse out on your mate. Graffiti sounds a bit different. You're tagging ramps and rails by doing stunts. Bit of paint spraying with your skateboard. Trick Attack is a score challenge over 2 minutes. You can do your own thing or try and mess up your mate's run. Sounds alright for a bit of multiplayer madness. Jury. They reckon Tony Hawk's has got all the right moves for 2-player fun. Roller coaster ride on a wheelie plank. Bit dramatic, aren't they? Infoburst section mentions it's from Activision. 128 megabit cart, 1 or 2 players, needs 11 pages on the controller pack for saves, and it's out now. Cost is £40. Standard price for a new release back then, I suppose. Nothing too groundbreaking here, just a solid look at Tony Hawk's. This page is all about Tony Hawk's skateboarding on the N64, and it's a review, titled in a bit of a trendy way, K's Arding. The reviewer reckons it's something that looks good on the telly, especially when shown late night in slow motion. A bit sarcastic there, eh? But they admit it's actually decent fun to play. Or? They talk about the park strife mode, saying there are 3 skate parks designed for maximum stunt potential. Instead of just going for a high score, you actually compete against another skater in a tense contest over 3 one-minute heats. And your best 2 scores are combined for the final total. Sounds a bit different to the usual score attack, which is good. Apparently these skate parks are also good for 2-player graffiti games. Using ramps and rails to steal tagged objects sounds like a laugh with mates. Then there's a section on skaters. Apparently there are 10 skaters in total, plus 2 secret ones. Each skater has strengths and weaknesses, as you'd expect. But they reckon the game forces you to play with all of them unless you've got enough tapes in career mode, which is a bit of a weird system. If your chosen skater isn't good enough for later levels, you have to play through again with a different character, which is a bit of a faff but not too bad apparently, as you can collect all 5 tapes from an earlier level pretty quickly once you know what you're doing. A bit of an odd way of doing things though, they say. The lifespan section describes the gameplay style as a halfway house between the realism of 1080 degrees on the 64 and the simplicity of Snowboard Kids, but when it comes to stunts, Tony Hawk's is in a league of its own. They say it's all about tricks, flips and grabs, and it's easy to learn how to play, but then you can combine the basics into something spectacular. They reckon even average players can pull off some flashy moves pretty quickly, and it's a treat to watch, even the demo sequences. They like the animation and camera work, which makes the tricks look dizzying, and the way the horizon tilts when you're landing a big jump. They mention you can do tricks off corners and pipes, which creates a real sense of danger even though there's not much blood, just sound effects for heavy falls in the original PlayStation version, which is a bit odd to mention in an N64 mag, but there you go. So there are little captions next to screenshots giving tips, like hopping from a rail to a wall for big points, building up the special bar to activate incredible moves, using replay mode, using the nollie to impress mates, and jumping on moving cars for points. Overall it sounds like they think it's a good game, easy to pick up and play, and looks pretty flashy too. Not bad for a skateboarding game, especially back then. This page is all about Tony Hawk's Pro Skater on the N64. It's a review section, breaking down the core of the game, which is, obviously, pulling off stunts. They've detailed the basic tricks like the ollie, grind, kickflip, railslide and aerial, explaining what they are in game terms. Looking at the pluses and minuses, they reckon the stunts are fantastic, levels are inventive, and controls are easy, plus a decent 2-player mode. The downsides are no analog control, and some pop-up issues in complicated levels. Yeah, pop-up was just a thing back then, wasn't it? Underneath they've got a, if you like this, box plugging 1080 degrees snowboarding, giving it a hefty 89%. Says it's a winter sports masterpiece with more subtlety and fewer stunts. A lot more subtlety apparently. Then there's a breakdown of scores. 8 for visuals, 8 for sounds, 7 for mastery, and 8 for lifespan. Solid scores all round really. See, the overall verdict is pretty glowing, calling it original, intuitive and enjoyable, and reckons it set a high standard for skateboarding games on the N64. They gave it an 86% and a Star Game Award, which was a big deal back then for N64 Magazine. Martin Kitts is the reviewer, and he seems impressed, saying if you're even remotely interested in skateboarding, this is as close as you can get to the real thing. He does mention the lack of analog control is a bit of a black mark, but overall, it's a really positive review for what was and still is a classic game. Loads of screenshots dotted about showing off the gameplay, and tricks too, looking pretty good for the N64. This page is from the Import Arena section, and it's all about Custom Robo on the N64, a Japanese import. They start off by reminding you that because the N64 isn't region-locked, they can bring you reviews of games from Japan and America before they might even come out here in the UK. Custom Robo itself looks like a bit of a chaotic multiplayer brawler. The reviewer reckons the multiplayer is quick and smooth, and the arenas are compact and well designed for fast-paced action, no hiding apparently. They've got screenshots showing different arenas, one's like a spooky mansion, another a bit more industrial looking. They point out you can jet up to higher spots and show a face-off between two robots, wondering who'll win. There's an info burst box with the game details. It's from Nintendo, on a 96 megabit cartridge, supports 1 or 2 players, and you'll need a controller pack to save your game. No expansion pack, rumble pack or transfer pack needed. It was already out in Japan and coming to the US at some point. Cost about £35, which was typical for an import game at the time. Jesuette. Then there's a section called RPG Mania, describing the single player. Sounds like it's got a bit of a Pokemon vibe. Battling to become the best, and upgrade your robot. They say there are loads of places to explore, but the battling mainly happens in the Custom Robo Center. They do mention it's very text-heavy in Japanese, so unless you can read it you might be a bit lost, but you could probably figure it out. They also found the world map a bit odd, making everything shrink down except you, which they thought was a bit freaky. So overall, sounds like a fun import for robot battling fans who weren't afraid of a bit of Japanese text. This page is all about Custom Robo, a quirky little game that was definitely trying to ride the Pokemon wave back in the day. It's got this robot building aspect which they're really pushing here, saying you can create your own bot from loads of different parts. They're showcasing the robot creation process, picking body types, weapons like guns and missile launchers, loads to choose from apparently. Jetpacks and boots are also in the mix, making for some aerial dodging action it seems. The review talks about the battles being quick and frantic, with rapid pink explosions. Sounds pretty standard N64 fare, visually. They mention the opponent being a slow-moving beast and needing to scoot around by double-tapping the R button. There's a nod to the RPG mode, but they admit it's incomprehensible after the first few battles, which isn't exactly a ringing endorsement, is it? But they do say the free play and 2-player modes are fun. The pluses and minuses bit is classic magazine stuff. Pluses are superb robot building concept, loads of weapons, and great 2-player battles. Minuses are that RPG mode being a bit of a mess, not terribly strategic, and ultimately a little simple. Harsh but fair probably. If you like this, section points to Last Legion UX, which I vaguely remember. They reckon Custom Robo is a middle-of-the-road huge robot combat simulator. Not exactly setting the world on fire then. Jorting costly. Accessibility-wise, they're saying if you can't read Japanese you'll struggle with the RPG mode, which is stating the obvious. Visually, it's bright and superbly designed, but lacking in detail. Sounds about right for an N64 game. Sounds are cheery Japanese music and splendid sound effects. Standard. Mastery is described as deftly realized and plenty to the RPG mode, even though they just said the RPG mode was incomprehensible. Bit contradictory there, lads. Lifespan is plenty of weapons and add-ons. Verdict is a tremendously quirky game, obviously inspired by Pokemon. They've given it 83%, which is a pretty decent score. Building robots and making them fight has never been such fun, they claim. Bit of hyperbole, but it probably was alright for a laugh. Jess Bickham's name is at the bottom, so he must be the reviewer. Overall, sounds like a decent enough robot battler, bit niche, but hey, N64 had plenty of those. This page is the start of the Club 64 section in the magazine. It's the part dedicated to helping N64 owners get the most out of their games. This month the top guide is for Ridge Racer 64, classic arcade racing action on the N64. They're promising stacks of tips to be the fastest on 4 wheels. Ridge Racer 64, good times, proper fast-paced stuff. Warrington Wall. Looking at the other features in this section, we have the Club 64 mailbox for letters and reader feedback, always a bit of a laugh to see what people are moaning about. Then there's a how-to guide for Resident Evil 2, looks like they're covering the bonus levels, probably showing you how to unlock tofu mode or something daft like that. Tips Extra is always handy for general N64 tips, and Dr. Kit's Game Clinic, that was always a weird one, some sort of gaming advice column with a strange sense of humor. Game On is about getting more out of older games, probably dusting off some classics. I'm the Best looks like it's about online leagues or competitions, maybe for some of the online-enabled N64 games, if there were any at this point, or perhaps local multiplayer leagues. Then there's something called NUW. Millennium Skill Club, looks like a feature about gaming skills, probably related to the Millennium bug hype that was still lingering around. The directory is a rundown of every N64 game rated, could be useful to see what they thought of games you were considering buying, and back issues and subscriptions for anyone wanting to grab older magazines or subscribe. The little image of the magazine cover there shows Ridge Racer 64 is the main feature for this issue, and it's all dated May 2000. Right then, let's get into those Ridge Racer 64 tips. Need to shave a few seconds off my lap times. This page is the mailbox section from issue 41 looks like. The letters page, always a bit of a giggle. First up we've got Star Letter, and someone called Dean Bycroft from West Yorkshire has sent in some frankly bizarre hand art impressions of the N64 staff. He reckons he's recreated them all using just his hands, which is Warrington. Well, it's certainly something. He even makes a comparison to that fat ugly thing from Turok 2, which I remember being a right beast in that game. Proper nasty looking. Ed, the editor, seems to think the likeness to Jess is uncanny, whoever Jess is. Looking at these hand shapes, they're supposed to be different staff members. There's Jess, Tim, Neil, Paul, Mark again apparently showing his dark side, Justin, Martin, Andrea, and Will. Some of them are a bit of a stretch if you ask me, but I suppose it's the thought that counts. Dearly departed Neil, one for the mums. That's a bit cryptic, wonder what happened to Neil. And Will's world-conquering hair, blimey, must have been something to behold. Then we've got the correction corner, always good for a bit of a chuckle at their mistakes. Seems Andy Scheuber was called Scheuber in the Game Boy Gallery, Jan Kaitila was Castilla in Game On, and Carla Hodge was Carla Hidge. Oops. And then Adam Smallton is having a proper moan about Mario Kart 64 screenshots being in the directory section instead of proper N64 screenshots. Talk about picky, eh? Ed even comments on it. Menity. Underpaid loads. Jimmy Broadbent from Yorkshire is asking why they had 5 N64s in a picture on page 3. Turns out they have 3 NTSC machines and 2 PAL ones for testing games from different regions. Makes sense, especially back then with region locking being a proper pain. They even mention borrowed controllers. Sounds like a bit of a chaotic setup they had in the office. Lastly, there's Therapy. This fella got an N64 and GoldenEye 007 for his 50th birthday, and now he's hooked on F1 World Grand Prix and Agent Under Fire, so much so that his family are joking about sending him for therapy. GoldenEye and F1 World Grand Prix, classic games back in the day, I can see how you could get lost in them. Agent Under Fire though, Baideko. That's a bit more of a mixed bag Bond game if I'm honest, not quite GoldenEye standard but still. N64 in 2000, good times. This page is the mailbox section of the magazine, Club 64. It kicks off with readers' letters. Someone called James Francis from Plymouth is writing in about Donkey Kong 64 and his banana collection, even joking about old people still enjoying it. Ed, the editor, chimes in with some light-hearted banter, calling someone older than game reviewer Will a rarity. There's a letter complaining about Donkey Kong 64's plastic game box, mentioning it's environmentally unfriendly compared to PlayStation boxes, and Ed apologizes for that. Then there's a section called Basically Anything, where a reader, Sam Philip Stratton from London, is asking for advice on getting into video game journalism. Ed's advice is pretty sound: get some qualifications, preferably in English, and keep writing. He mentions that practical experience on a magazine like N64 is invaluable, and highlights the day-to-day tasks like playing and writing about games. He names Future as a publishing house, and N64 Magazine specifically, which is pretty meta. Stumbled is a short piece about a reader, Martin Reynolds from Glasgow, who spotted a tree in Universal Studios Florida that looks like the Great Deku Tree from Zelda 64, and Ed makes a pun about it being tremendous. Moving on, Profit is a rumor section, mentioning internet whispers about Nintendo delaying Dolphin, which we now know as the GameCube, until the third quarter. Lastly, there's Dream On, where readers pitch game ideas. Oliver Booth from Sheffield suggests Pokemon Football, imagining Pokemon teams and special moves, and Ed calls it clever, and a potential surefire hit in the UK. Ian Armstrong from Colchester proposes Escape, a game where you're a CIA agent using makeshift weapons like typewriters and pencils, and Ed thinks the makeshift weapon idea is ace. There are small screenshots of Pokemon Football idea with mock-ups, and a text box for Escape idea, with a small image of what might be the game. This page is the bonus letters section, typical reader mail for N64 Magazine back in the day. Kicking off, we've got folks writing in about rumors they've heard, like this one about the Dolphin. That's what we all knew the GameCube as back then, being delayed. Seems there was some kerfuffle about licensing and greedy tactics, which is standard industry talk, in it. They reckon it'll still hit in the first half of 2001. Blimey, feels like ages ago now. 1. Then there's a funny one about a reader bumping into Eric Stewart, who voiced James from Pokemon, in Stockport of all places. Small world, eh? Oh, and someone's gone full-on wordplay with Pokemon and celebrity names, calling it Starmie-Dust. They've come up with crackers like Roy Volterbison, Alvin Starmie-Dust, and Yasser Abrafat. Bit of a laugh, I suppose, if you're into that sort of thing. Down at the bottom, they've got the "So tell me this" bit, answering readers' questions. Someone's asking if Dolphin is just a code name. Well, yeah, duh, we knew that, but good question for the time, I suppose. Then there's questions about Factor 5, the Rogue Squadron lot, and if they're doing a new space shooter. They reckon maybe, could be Spaceset, Juta. Someone else is asking about The World Is Not Enough, rivaling GoldenEye. Cheeky question. They're saying nah, not really in the same league as GoldenEye, more like Duke Nukem. 0 Hour. Technically sound, but not amazing. And another asking about Perfect Dark controls compared to GoldenEye. Seems they're pretty much the same. Good news that. Right, import prices from New Zealand for Resident Evil 2 are mentioned. Blimey, sounds expensive, compared to Zelda. And a question about Zelda Gaiden getting an expansion pack. They reckon unlikely, as Japanese devs weren't into that then. Then a random one about Terranigma, that old SNES RPG coming to the N64. They're basically saying, forget about it, focus is on Mother 3 Earthbound 64 to us in the UK. And lastly, someone's wondering about Snowboard Kids 2, and the mag is saying it's looking unlikely despite the first one doing alright. Oh, and news on Eternal Darkness. Check page 30 apparently. War Eternal Darkness. Right at the top there's a picture of Abra, the psychic Pokemon, looking a bit thoughtful. All in all, a typical letters page. Mix of rumors, daft jokes, and game questions. Takes you back, doesn't it? This page is from the Club 64 mailbox section, specifically the N64 board. Right at the top we have Dolphin Factory, asking what Nintendo's next console, codenamed Dolphin, is going to look like. First up, Michael Donaghy from Ipswich has sent in my ideas for the Dolphin, suggesting it uses N64 controllers and is compatible with the Game Boy Advanced. He's even drawn top and side views, bless him. He thinks the Dolphin might not have a cartridge slot, which shows he was thinking ahead of the curve a bit, ditching the old 64DD cart system. Then we have Ben Randall from Eastleigh with my Dolphin gun ideas. This chap has drawn a fancy-looking light gun rifle for the Dolphin, with volume and rocket buttons, saying it's the first of 2 drawings. He's gone into detail about adjusting the sights, which is good thinking for a light gun. Ben's second idea is my Dolphin ideas too, and this time he's suggesting the Dolphin should be a DVD player. He's drawn a console and controller design, suggesting a standard DVD unit with luscious blue trimmings and a particularly clever DVD remote control placed into the style controller. He reckons it's a winner. Play standard D unit. Moving on to the actual N64 board section, where readers have sent in their artwork. We've got a mad bad Conker picture from Andreas Jorgensen in Denmark. A decent Conker drawing it is too. That Conker's Bad Fur Day game was something else, wasn't it? Quite adult themed for a Nintendo game. Martin Weller from Tadworth sent in a Super Smash Bros. Drawing, and it's packed with characters: Mario, Donkey Kong, Pikachu, Yoshi, Link, Samus, Kirby, Fox, and even the Polygon team. Super Smash Bros. Was massive back then, everyone loved it. A proper multiplayer classic. Packed with Castra. Another excellent drawing, this time from Tracy Chung in Bristol, is Zelda, Ocarina of Time themed. It's got Link, Zelda, Ganondorf, and Saria, all in a nice style. Ocarina of Time still holds up as one of the best games ever made, doesn't it? Dwayel David from Belgium has sent in a Mario color swap drawing, showing before and after. Bit of a simple one this, but Mario's always good. Lastly, Donna Pisani from Wokingham thinks there's too much fuss about the evil of Pokemon, and she's right. She's drawn 2 Pikachus, one with guns and looking a bit mean, and another normal cute Pikachu holding a Pokeball to show the difference. Pokemon was a phenomenon. Everyone was playing it, even if some people thought it was all a bit much. This page is all about Ridge Racer 64, right in the thick of the N64 days. It's a how-to guide to pass your test in the game, which is a bit of a laugh as if it's some kind of driving school, innit? There's a rather digital-looking lady on the page, sort of staring into your soul. Maybe she's the Ridge Racer mascot? Who knows? Anyway, they reckon Ridge Racer 64 is fantastic, and apparently it didn't impress them at some big games show initially, but the developers NTSC worked their magic to make it the quickest, prettiest, and most rip-roaringly enjoyable racer on the N64. Bit strong that, but you know, magazine talk. Nista? They do admit it's hard as nails though, which is probably true. Ridge Racer games were always a bit tough to master properly. There's a section called What We Said, and they gave it a stonking 91% in a previous issue, calling it a perfectly crafted marvel. High praise indeed. Then there are some tips with screenshots, saying about power sliding being essential, and some car called Atomic Purple being fast. They also mention star cars, and specifically pack racing, talking about a car called RT Savalou which is faster but harder to handle, and a pack-daubed racer which is a bit easier and has better handling. Sounds like they're trying to help you pick a decent ride to get started. All in all, it's a look at Ridge Racer 64, positioning it as a top-tier racer on the N64, even if it's a bit of a challenge. Good game though back in the day, even if it was a bit unforgiving. This page is all about getting to grips with Ridge Racer 64, which, let's be honest, was a decent enough addition to the N64 racing roster at the time, even if it was a bit of a portable port. It's got sections on cornering techniques, breaking it down into the racing line, and successful power sliding. For the racing line, it shows you visually how to approach a right-hander, telling you to start wide, cut in, and straighten out gradually. Power sliding gets a bit more involved. It's the usual stuff, releasing the accelerator, wrenching the stick, and getting the car sideways to drift around corners before straightening up and flooring it again. Then there's a section on overtaking, which boils down to using downhill sections and tunnels to your advantage, hugging the inside line on corners, and maybe a cheeky power slide if you're feeling confident. Below that, they're talking about specific cars, the Galaga RT series, Assoluto Infinito, and Atomic Purple. Apparently the Galaga range, despite having daft names, are fast for intermediate and expert races. The Assoluto Infinito is described as nippier and uniformly high in stats, bit generic if you ask me. And finally, the Atomic Purple is mentioned as a good all-rounder, less likely to bash into walls, suitable for championship races. It's all standard racing game advice really, but back then, in 00, we lapped it up, didn't we? Always eager to find any edge in games like Ridge Racer 64. This page is all about Ridge Racer 64, a decent arcade racer on the N64. It's giving out some tips for the Ridge Racer tracks, broken down into normal, expert and extreme difficulty levels, which is fair enough. For the novice/intermediate normal setting, they reckon you should be using the pack racing/Galaga RT Prids car. The tips are your basic racing line stuff, sticking to the inside of tunnels, power sliding around corners and the like. For the slightly harder expert normal setting, the advice is for the Galaga RT Carrot car, focusing on keeping your foot down and power sliding through the spends. Then for extreme normal, they're suggesting the Atomic Purple motor, telling you to hug the inside of corners and how to navigate the tunnels. Standard stuff really, but back in the day, these little guides in mags were gold dust if you were stuck on a particular game, weren't they? Always felt a bit cheaty mind you, but sometimes you just needed that extra nudge. This page is all about getting better at Ridge Racer 64, a launch title if I recall, which is still pretty decent fun even now. It's got these Revolution Tracks tips, breaking it down into novice, intermediate, and expert sections. For novices, it's using the pack racing car for normal mode, and RT Xevious Green for the extra mode. The tips are really basic stuff, like power sliding on grassy bits, watching for merging lanes, releasing the accelerator on bumps, and general cornering advice. It's proper beginner stuff. Intermediate level uses Galaga RT Prid for normal, and White Angel for extra. Now we're getting to gentle turning, power sliding after bridges, keeping right on certain corners and more power sliding around checkpoints. Standard Ridge Racer fare really. Faff. Finally for experts they suggest Galaga RT Carrot for normal, and White Angel again for extra. This is where they talk about weaving through tunnels, taking racing lines, power sliding early and often, and managing corners to avoid bumps. Proper racing lines and advanced power sliding is what it's all about at this level. Sorry, nearly slipped up there. Each section has little screenshots showing the track and where you should be doing these things. It's a fairly straightforward guide to getting better at Ridge Racer 64. though whether it actually helps that much is another question entirely. Still, in 2000 this sort of thing was probably gold dust for some players. This page is a guide to mastering the Renegade Tracks course in Ridge Racer 64. Ridge Racer 64, now that was a decent arcade racer on the N64. Not quite F-Zero X levels of speed, but still good fun. Anyway, this page breaks down the course into novice, intermediate and expert difficulties, across both normal and extra track layouts. For novice normal, they point out the gentle slopes, which, yeah, they are hardly Mount Everest, are they? And the tip is to follow the track on the bends, groundbreaking stuff. They recommend the pack racing car, which is a solid all-rounder, to be fair, King. Then for novice extra, it's all about the downhill spiral at the start and overtaking early. The RT Xevious green car is suggested for this, likely for its handling. Moving on to intermediate normal, they mention a hump after the first checkpoint, could catch you out if you're not paying attention I suppose. And power sliding through 90-degree turns, bit of a standard racing technique really. Gallagher RT Prid's car is the choice here. Intermediate extra talks about rocks and downhill curves. Don't worry too much about hitting the rock, they say. Helpful. And apparently the final two turns are power slidable, news to me. And the White Angel is the recommended car. Finally, for expert normal, it's about the chicane and taking a straight path. The Gallagher RT Carrot is the car for this challenge. And expert extra? Slingshot around the first corner, and cut out the first two bends of the dirt chicane apparently. The Assoluto Infinito is their car of choice, probably for its speed. So there you have it, a full breakdown of how to tackle Renegade Tracks. Whether you actually needed this much guidance for Ridge Racer 64 is another question. But hey, magazines needed to fill pages somehow back in the day. This page is all about conquering those bonus levels in Resident Evil 2 on the N64. Remember Resident Evil 2? What a game that was. Properly scary on the N64. And this is a guide on how to ace the extra quests after you've finished the main game. Apparently if you got an A rating in the main game, you could play as Hunk, that umbrella bloke trying to nick the G-Virus, and even as Tofu, that mad knife-wielding block of, well, Tofu, mad, Brintinter, Rakunk. This guide here is for the sewers level, and it's a step-by-step thing with pictures. First off, you gotta run up the stairs. Then, as Hunk, you're supposed to take out the first couple of zombies on the walkway, then lure out the others. They even tell you to stab the female zombie with Tofu, which sounds a bit much, even for Resident Evil. In the corridor, you're weaving past zombies, classic resi dodging. Then you've gotta watch out for spider poison outside the corner. Lovely. After that, it's about holding back to run past some more nasties, and then in the cells you shoot crawlers, and weave past even more zombies. Finally, in the garage you just jink left and right, and you're through. Simple, right? Dorika. They've even got a what we said bit, bragging about their 90% review score back in issue 36. They reckon it was a flawless conversion and utterly gripping. 90%, eh? Fair play, it was a cracking game back then. Good times. This page is all about surviving the bonus levels in Resident Evil 2 on the N64. It's a how-to guide, classic magazine stuff, breaking down the Tofu and Hunk scenarios. It's split into sections like station corridors, main station, upstairs and the last tyrant, each with numbered steps and little screenshots showing what to do. For station corridors, it starts with dealing with crows in a cellar, and then moves on to Mr. Mutt, that's good old William Birkin, the G-Virus monstrosity, in his first form. The tip is to hug the right wall to avoid him. Then there's advice on handling zombies in the east hallway and reception area. Fairly standard zombie dodging stuff if you know Resi 2. Main station is all about the lickers and those plant enemies that spit acid. It talks about using pillars to avoid spider enemies, that's likely those annoying web spinners, and weaving around lickers. There's also advice on using the veggie varmints, which are those Plant 42 clones in the station, and dealing with the tyrant. Luring him out and weaving around, standard tyrant tactics really. Upstairs focuses on more lickers, and the library being an empty area, well, it is after you've been through it once. It mentions plants on the upper balcony, and the advice is simply handgun. Then it's about the final corridor with zombies, suggesting shotgun for Hunk, or dodging for Tofu, and stabbing away from a safe point. Sounds like classic Tofu scenario madness. Finally, the last tyrant section, which is the tyrant fight at the end. For Hunk, it suggests either smashing past him or backing up and unloading all your weapons. For Tofu, it just says a brief pasting is obligatory, which is putting it mildly for the Tofu run. All in all, a pretty standard guide for getting through those extra modes in Resi 2. Remember Tofu? Bonkers idea really, but good fun at the time, proper tough challenge. The next page is all about cheat codes. Proper cheeky cheats for a couple of games. First up is Top Gear Rally 2. Remember that one? A decent racer, not as good as say Mario Kart or Diddy Kong Racing, but it had its moments. Here they've got loads of codes. Chubby worldview, sounds a bit daft, makes the world look fatter apparently. High res mode, probably for the expansion pack owners, to make it look a bit less blurry. No damage, repair power, always handy for those tricky races. Topsy-turvy, and wobble tire, probably just silly visual things to mess around with. They also have codes for extra credits, and bouncy cars, which sounds like a laugh. Boring too. Then there's battle tanks, global assault. That was a good bit of tank-based action. Proper explosions and that. They've got codes for all weapons, Brandon's gang, invincibility, all the usual stuff you'd expect. Secret level and bonus level codes for a bit extra. And then some weapon power-up tips for single and multiplayer, using power-ups to get an extra kick out of your weapons. Good stuff for anyone wanting to mess about and unlock everything, especially in battle tanks. That game could get a bit frantic. This page is all about cheat codes and tips for a few N64 games. Right at the top they're saying butter your gaming toast with tips, a bit of typical magazine waffle really, voila. First up is Supercross 2000. They're giving a load of cheat codes to put in, things like making all the other riders block you, having massive bikes, and even no riders at all, which sounds a bit pointless doesn't it? There's one for headless rider and moon gravity, which are probably a laugh. Back in the day we loved silly cheats like that. You had to press top C at the select event screen, sounds like a faff but we were used to it, guru. Then there's Ridge Racer 64, they're talking about motion blur, and how to turn it on and off in replays by pressing left C, which is hardly earth-shattering is it? The other tip is for the caddy car, which they admit is not exactly fast, but it's a hidden car. You have to do some daft thing, like drive into a wall backwards, at the start of the first Grand Prix race, and then win in reverse. Sounds a bit long-winded for a caddy car, but completionists probably went for it. Finally, there's a classic tip for Turok 2. They're saying because Perfect Dark wasn't out yet, Turok games were still popular for first-person shooting thrills. They're giving the big cheat code BEWAREOBLIVIONISATHAND, which unlocks everything in the game. All weapons, ammo, invincibility, the lot. They say it's blimming great, which is magazine speak for quite good. Turok 2 was pretty gory for its time, and Rage Wars was decent for multiplayer on the N64, especially if Perfect Dark wasn't around. This page showcases the reader's top 15 tips, which was always a good read in Club 64, proper community feel to it back then. Right at the top, number 1 is for Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. It's a bit of a cheeky tip really, suggesting you downgrade everyone else's pod racer parts to make your chosen racer look even faster. Classic exploiting the game mechanics. Gah! Next up at number 2 and 5 we've got Resident Evil 2. One tip is for playing as Tofu, which was a bizarre unlockable character. The cheat code involves a long D-pad and button sequence, typical for Resi back then. The other Resi 2 tip is for invincibility, again another button mashing combo at the load game screen. These codes were gold dust back in the day before the internet was everywhere. Warranty, tip 3 and 15 are for Donkey Kong 64. One is about targeting orange grenades by switching to target mode and pressing Z and right C. The other DK64 tip is about a glitch that lets you see inside boxes by changing camera angles with the C buttons when near them. DK64 was massive, remember all those collectibles? Some were really sneaky to find. Quarintra. Number 4 is for Toy Story 2, giving access to all levels by pressing up, down and start a load of times at the title screen. Toy Story 2 on the N64 was a decent platformer, surprisingly good timing. Tip 6 is for Zelda Ocarina of Time. It's about getting free arrows by talking to the girl on the red roof in Kokiri Forest, after Z targeting her with a bow and arrow. Ocarina, what can you say? Absolute masterpiece. Everyone was obsessed with finding every little secret in that game. B. Number 7 is another Donkey Kong 64 tip. This one is for the Jack-in-the-Box boss fight. It's a simple strategy to just stay on the platform edge and wait for the boss to come to you. Bit cheesy, but hey, if it works. Peekabus. Tip 8 is back to Resident Evil 2 again, this time for infinite ammo, another complex button sequence at the load game screen. Infinite ammo in Resi, that's proper carnage. Haka. Tip 9 is yet another Resident Evil 2 tip, about speeding up text scrolling by holding the action button down. Handy for getting through the game quicker, especially on repeat playthroughs trying for the best rank. Gexy. Tip 10 is for Jet Force Gemini. It's about using shurikens to easily dispose of those annoying evil shield drones. Jet Force Gemini was a bit underrated. Remember the tribal bears? Meh. Number 11 is for Shadowman, a proper dark and gritty game. This tip is about finding hidden souls in the Temple of Life level after getting the Gad's search. Shadowman was quite atmospheric, a bit different from the usual N64 fare. Number 12 is for Jet Force Gemini again, about conserving Jet Force flares and plasma power by holding down Z to power up the shotgun, and then down Z again to use less ammo. Clever trick for resource management, and then down Z again. Number 13 is for Rogue Squadron, suggesting you select the moon level and find the generator to destroy it with torpedoes, rather than shooting it to avoid crashing. Rogue Squadron, now that was a proper Star Wars game on the N64, proper dogfights. Warranting. Number 14 is for Diddy Kong Racing. This one is about using the cheat code Joint Venture to remove trees in 2-player adventure mode, making it easier to find silver coins. DKR was a great kart racer, proper rival to Mario Kart back then, and Nolsa. Daidina. Finally, tip 16 is for Donkey Kong 64 again. It's just a general tip to use the camera angles with the C buttons to see inside boxes. Below the tip section, there's a Your Top Tip form to cut out and send in. It's got spaces for name, address, postcode, and then sections to write your tip for a game and what you found. Proper old school way of sharing gaming secrets back then. And at the bottom right is Tips Extra section, with the address to send your tips to and instructions if you don't want to cut up the magazine, just photocopy it. Good times. This page is Dr. Kit's Game Clinic, a regular feature for us N64 owners back in the day. You see this sort of thing in magazines all the time, people writing in with their gaming problems. First up, we've got Greg from Birmingham asking about the jogging man in Zelda Ocarina of Time. He needs to flog him the bunny mask, bless him. Dr. Kits, or Algernon as we now know from later in the column, tells him the running man is knocking about Lon Lon Ranch, but only when you're little Link and at dusk. Good tip that, everyone remembers the running man Knockistra. Then there's Chris, who's struggling with the green key on Vela's first mission in Jet Force Gemini. Dr. Kits lays it out, saying you need to blow up the glass in the circular room with the plasma smithereens. The plasma death, which is the weapon you'll find, and then use the shotgun to get a crate with the key in. Simple when you know how. In it, use the key in. Peter from Cranleigh is on Donkey Kong 64 and wants to know where the Nintendo coin is on the last level. Dr. Kits says it's in the Frantic Factory level, and you have to complete the original Donkey Kong arcade game twice to get it. Twice! That's a bit of a grind, even for completionists back then. Helena from Chelsea is having trouble with the grasshopper bosses in Jet Force Gemini again, those Lupin mid-game bosses. Dr. Kits tells her to blast their arms off first, and then use the machine gun when their tails are vulnerable, and the pistol when they hop on rocks. Classic boss strategy really, just shoot the weak points. Atol. Finally, Sean from Sunderland wants to know how to fly a Naboo fighter in Rogue Squadron. Dr. Kits, in a bit of a cryptic manner, mentions passcodes at the passcode screen. Halifax? Warrant Mator. Press enter. Warrant Mator. Warrant Mator. Press enter again, and you'll get the yellow and chrome beauty. Passcodes were all the rage then, weren't they? There are screenshots dotted about, one of Link from Zelda talking to someone, another of Donkey Kong fighting those insect blighters, and one of a Naboo fighter in Rogue Squadron. Standard magazine fare really, helping us poor gamers out when we got stuck. Good times. This page is all about game challenges, right? 8 challenges to test the best, it says. Bit ambitious maybe, but alright. It's got 4 games showcased here. GoldenEye 007, Diddy Kong Racing, Donkey Kong 64, and Resident Evil 2. Classic N64 stuff. In it? Bora. First up is GoldenEye, they're calling it Bond Bowls. Bit of a laugh really, using the level editor to make a bowling game with grenades. Sounds like a right mess, but probably a good laugh with mates back in the day. Apparently, you get medals for grenade bowling skills. Who knew that was a thing? Ooh, then there's Diddy Kong Racing, off-ground tag. That game was alright for multiplayer, wasn't it? This challenge is about using the plane or hovercraft to tag other players. Medals for tagging. Simple as that. Remember Diddy Kong Racing? Bit of a Mario Kart ripoff, but still decent fun, especially with mates after school. Watagal. Donkey Kong 64 is next, Kart Coin Challenge. They're talking about the minecart levels, which were a bit of alright in DK64 I suppose. Collect coins, avoid barrels, all that jazz. Medals for coin collecting, fair enough. DK64, massive game that was, eh? Took forever to 100% it if you ever bothered. All, Warrington Nor. Finally, Resident Evil 2, Zombie Takedown. Now this sounds a bit more like it. Headshots with a shotgun, classic Resi 2. But wait, no weapons allowed? Just wagging stick? Right, classic Riz School. Sounds like they want you to just smack zombies with Leon's elbow or something. Medals for zombie bashing without guns, apparently. Resi 2, proper scary game back then. Weren't many like it on the N64 to be fair, right? So yeah, 4 challenges for these N64 classics. Bit of fun if you were bored, I guess. Probably tried a couple of these myself back in the day. Or something similar at least. GoldenEye Level Editor was a proper time sink when you got into it. This page is all about challenges for your N64 games, right in the heart of the magazine. It's got Club 64 inches at the top, telling you it's 8 challenges to test the best, though they only show 4 here. Maybe the other 4 are elsewhere in the mag, or perhaps they just couldn't be bothered to come up with 8 properly good ones. First up, we've got Super Smash Bros, and they're calling it Proximity Punch-Up. The idea is you need to unlock the item switch, which back then felt like a proper achievement, playing 50 versus matches in a row. Madness. Anyway, once you've done that, you're supposed to set up a match on Hyrule Castle, turn off all power-ups except for the motion sensor bomb, and just fill the place with proximity mines. Then you and a mate are to run from one side to the other, racking up laps, while avoiding getting blown to bits. Gold is 10+ laps, silver is 5+, and bronze is 3+. Sounds a bit chaotic, probably hilarious with the right mates. Then it's GoldenEye 007 with License to Kill, a lot. This one's from a reader, Aaron Jones. Fair play to Aaron. The challenge is to set off the alarms in the compound building of Surface 2, which anyone who's played GoldenEye knows is just asking for trouble, and then take out guards, whilst only picking up 1 piece of body armor. The aim is headshots, and lots of them. 20 headshots for gold, 10 for silver, and 5 for bronze. Good luck with that. Surface 2 guards are no mugs, even on Agent. Next we're on to WWF WrestleMania 2000 and Hate Triangle. This one's a bit of a grapplethon. You're supposed to pick Tori, remember him? Souse, and do a 3-way dance against Kane and The Undertaker, both CPU controlled, naturally. No time limit, no pins, no ring outs, just try to break bones as fast as possible. Apparently some bloke called Ian Tollerton got it done in 20 seconds, and they're challenging readers to beat that. Gold is 25 seconds, silver is 40 seconds, and bronze is 60 seconds. Seems quite specific, but wrestling games back then were all about button mashing chaos, so who knows what's possible. Goldu. Finally for Mario Party, it's Crazy Cannons. This one's on Wario's Battle Canyon board. You need to use the cannons to land on as many islands as you can. Gold is 4 islands, silver is 3, and bronze is 2. Sounds simpler than it probably is. Mario Party was always good for wrecking friendships, even with seemingly easy challenges. Gold is 4 islands. Down at the bottom it says, now it's your turn, game on, and they're asking for readers to send in their own challenge ideas. They are especially keen on challenges for Ridge Racer 64, Donkey Kong 64, Jet Force Gemini, and Resident Evil 2. If they print yours, you get a fancy N64 pin badge. They give an address to send your ideas to. Game on, N64 Magazine, 30 Monmouth Street, Bath. Bath! Posher than I remember N64 Magazine being. It's all about weird and wonderful ways to play your games, apparently. Good stuff. This page is all about bad losers, which is a bit of a laugh. It's pondering why baddies in games never really win, despite all their supposed master plans to take over the world, or kidnap princesses, you know, the usual villain stuff. They even mention Seven and The Empire Strikes Back as films where the bad guys actually do alright sometimes, but reckon in games, it's almost unheard of. Apparently, even the fleeting moments of success for baddies in games like Shadow Man and Legion are few and far between, which is probably true when you think about it. There's a cartoon drawing of a typical villain planning to take down a hero, presumably failing miserably as usual, right there on a drawing board, with old Ganondorf from Zelda looming over it all. It's a fair point, isn't it? You never really see the bad guys come out on top in these games, do you? They're always just a bit rubbish at the end of the day. The next page in N64 Magazine is looking at bad losers, which is a bit of a laugh really. It features K. Rool from Donkey Kong 64 and Giannis from GoldenEye 007, giving them both a bit of stick. For K. Rool, they're laying out his credentials as a bad guy, banana stealing, driving around islands, being a marble-eyed Kremlin croc, and apparently a bit of a chimp killer, which is a bit harsh. They highlight the boxing match in Donkey Kong 64 as his final battle, asking questions like, why boxing, when you could just spray coconuts or reverse your island? They reckon the boxing match was a terrible decision, which is fair enough. It was a bit daft. They do think he'll be back though, probably wanting revenge after the Funky Kong boot gun incident. There's a funny bit where they've made up a fake interview with K. Rool interviewing henchmen, asking them if they're evil and if they can run with their arms stiff at their sides. Typical K. Rool really. Aha. Then there's Giannis, or Alec Trevelyan from GoldenEye. His bad guy credentials are listed as being a highly trained Zero agent gone rogue and Russian defector. Apparently he's all about world domination and money, and has some satellite sabotaging plan. The final battle is described as survival of the fittest, with a fake accented northern, which is a dig at his accent in the game. They reckon his downfall was trying to finish Bond on that tiny platform at the end of the cradle sequence, saying it's straight out of the big book of elaborate Bond villain masterplans that go wrong. They don't think he'll be back though, not after being shot and falling a mile, which is pretty definitive. Overall, it's a bit of fun taking the mickey out of these N64 villains. This page is all about bad losers, focusing on Bowser from Super Mario 64 and the campaigner from Turok, Dinosaur Hunter. It's a bit of a retrospective on these two villains and why they aren't exactly top-tier bad guys, despite their efforts. For Bowser, it talks about his frequent princess napping habits and his spiky personality. Classic Bowser really, the bad guy you secretly love. The article mentions his final battle in Mario 64, where he keeps using the same bomb scattering tactic, which is a bit daft when it didn't work the first time. Apparently Matza just picks him up by the tail and chucks him into his own bombs, which sounds about right for a Mario boss battle, a bit anticlimactic really. The reason he fails? Well, he keeps doing the same thing over and over, classic villain mistake. Will he return? Of course Bowser always comes back, maybe as some bespectacled nerdy version in the future, who knows, perhaps they are joking about the movie. Moving on to the campaigner from Turok. Apparently this fella is trying to bridge the Lost Lands with Earth using the Chronoceptor. The final battle with him is described as a bit of a joke. Mantis and Trek's battles sound cool, but then you're up against this short bloke in pants with a pickaxe. Bit underwhelming compared to taking on dinos with rocket launchers, innit? The reason he fails is obvious. Facing Turok with a pickaxe is never going to end well, especially when Turok has an arsenal of village-flattening weapons at his disposal. Will he return? Unlikely, as apparently he's dead and on fire. Nasty. Cheshibwa. There's a bit in the middle with some mocked-up blueprints for the campaigner's secret weapons. Things like the chain gun, particle accelerator, and fusion cannon, classic Turok weaponry names, but then they list things like terra nails and the stare, which are clearly taking the mickey. The stare weapon is particularly funny, just staring at Turok until he looks away. Genius. It's all a bit of a laugh at the expense of these villains who aren't exactly masterminds, but good fun all the same. This page delves into the minds of bad losers, specifically Gruntilda from Banjo-Kazooie and Ganon from Ocarina of Time, trying to figure out why these villains just can't seem to win. First up is Gruntilda. They've dubbed her bad girl credentials as being a wart-riddled witch, obsessed with beauty and kidnapping Banjo's sister, Tooty, all while rhyming every sentence, which, let's be honest, was a bit much even back then. The final battle section mentions how she almost makes a mockery of typical bad guy failures by having a question and answer session, which is kinda true. It was a bit different. Why it all went wrong? Reckons her downfall was down to being a bit of a mop, and not realizing that the jingo she scattered about might actually help Banjo and Kazooie. Plus, apparently shunning her family was a bit of a mistake. Will she return? Asks the question, confirming she will be back in Banjo-Tooie, despite being crushed by a boulder, described as a flat, disc-like creature, which is a bit of a strange way to describe her. There's even a funny little mock psychotherapy session, where the psychiatrist tries to get Gruntilda to stop rhyming, and questions her evil plans, concluding she isn't really that scary. Then it's Ganon's turn. His bad guy credentials are that he's a proper king of thieves type, bad to the bone and cunning, wanting the Triforce for unspeakable evil. You know the drill. The final battle section describes it as starting with lightning bolt tennis, and ending in a Mantapig transformation. Standard Ganon stuff really. Why it all went wrong? Points out that his pig brain and relying on the Triforce and the sages contributed to his downfall. Apparently, failing to realize the Ocarina of Time would let Link travel back and forth through time was a major oversight, and choosing to play his pipe organ instead of, say, picking off Link with a high-velocity sniper rifle during the final battle sealed his fate. Will he return? Reckons you can bet your house on it, mentioning he might even return in Zelda Gaiden, which was Majora's Mask in the US, wasn't it? Good old Ganon always popping up again. This page is a proper attention grabber for the next issue then, isn't it? Coming soon in, with big red letters, you couldn't miss it. And it's all about Perfect Dark. Unmissable, they're shouting. Of course back then Perfect Dark was absolutely massive news. Everyone was gagging for that game, especially after GoldenEye, and Rare were gods on the N64. The first review, the biggest review, the definitive verdict. They're really laying it on thick, aren't they? Typical magazine hyperbole, but you know, you lapped it up back then. You wanted to know everything about Perfect Dark, and N64 Magazine was promising the be-all and end-all review. Dare you miss out? Cheeky. And down at the bottom they're reminding everyone they're the UK's best-selling independent. Well, they were pretty good, can't deny that. Issue 41, blimey, feels like yesterday, and yet, donkeys years ago. This page of the magazine is issue 42, and kicking things off we've got a tipped section for Tony Hawk skateboarding. Seems like they're giving us some guidance on mastering the tricks like Madonnas and kickflips, all the bodacious stuff for the championship boarding. Moving down, there's a section shouting even more pics, showcasing screenshots from Zelda, Majora's Mask, Rika and Turok 3. Majora's Mask, everyone was still buzzing about that one back then, weren't they? Rika, I vaguely remember that, and Turok 3, dinosaurs and guns, you can't really go wrong. Then we've got the reviewed section with Mario Party 2, F1 Championship and Taz Express. Mario Party 2, always a laugh with mates, proper party game that. F1 Championship, the racing sim for the hardcore fans. And Taz Express, a bit of platforming fun with that Looney Tunes character. They're promising a whole lot more besides, and reminding us it's on sale Monday 15th of May. Below that it says Nintendo Magazine. Down the right side, there are yellow bullet points highlighting features like Skill Club Millennium, tons of new tips and cheats, the best special investigations, latest dolphin news, and they boldly claim, the only reviews you can trust. Bit cheeky that. Hackast. Then there's a big plus for Pokemon Stadium, promising an unmissably huge poker guide to get the best Pokemon and win all the cups. Of course, Pokemon was massive at this time. Under next month in Game Boy it mentions International Karate 2000, GB Advance News, Pokemon Yellow, and Driver, under-reviewed. Looks like they're teasing what's coming up in the next issue, on the Game Boy front. Right at the bottom it says May 2000, and page 121. So yeah, issue 42 covering all the N64, and Game Boy going Chusen for May 2000. This page is a bit of a bizarre one. It's an interview piece, or at least a fictional one, with Turok, the star of the game, in his new country mansion. They've gone all out portraying him as this gun-toting prehistoric poacher, which, to be fair, is pretty much what he is in the games. The headline is, Gun-toting star of Primogen Battle, Turok. Which is a bit much, isn't it, Primogen Battle? Bit dramatic for a game where you mostly just shot dinosaurs. Anyway, they've staged these photos of someone dressed as Turok, lounging about this posh house, filled with dinosaur bits and bobs. Apparently he's got a killing room built from Triceratops bones, which is charming. He even talks about testing out his weapons in there, and using a chronoceptor on villagers, bit harsh even for Turok. Then there's another bit about his sun lounge with a dinosaur head in it. They're really going for this prehistoric man in a modern world thing, aren't they? He's bragging about ripping the torso of a Triceratops with a PFM mine launcher. Honestly, the bloke's got a bit of a bloodlust, hasn't he? Mentioned something about a £10 million manor in the Lost Lands, which is just silly, but it's all part of the joke, I suppose. It's a bit of a strange feature, more about the character's persona than the game itself, really. Bit of a laugh, though. This page is the front cover of N64 Magazine, issue 41, dated May 2000. It's all about Jeremy McGrath's Supercross 2000, with a big picture of McGrath himself mid-jump on his motorbike. Classic acclaimed sports title, this one. Wasn't exactly pushing the N64 to its limits visually, if I'm honest, but for fans of motorbike games it was probably alright. Down the right side, in typical magazine cover style, are the games being reviewed in this issue. Looks like they're tackling Pokemon Stadium, which was a pretty big deal back then, finally seeing your Pokemon battles in 3D. Daikatana is listed, John Romero's big hyped FPS, remember that one? John Romero's about to make you his bitch marketing campaign, it was a bit much really. Winback is there, another shooter, probably trying to cash in on the GoldenEye craze. International Track and Field 2000, always good for a laugh with mates, button bashing galore. Tony Hawk Skateboarding, now that was a game changer, wasn't it? Properly captured skateboarding on consoles for the first time, everyone was trying to ollie after that. And Custom Robo, a bit of a weird one, customizable robots fighting each other, never really took off in the UK if I recall. Warrant. Then there's a section called Other Great Stuff, teasing future content. Zelda, Majora's Mask future look. Everyone was desperate for any info on that after Ocarina of Time. Turok 3, Shadow of Oblivion with new shots, more dinosaur blasting fun. Stunt Racer 64 Special Investigation, maybe they're digging deep into that one. Whatever happened to the Secret Games of 2000? Always intriguing, these behind-the-scenes looks at cancelled games. Latest Dolphin announcement, that's the codename for the GameCube. Exciting times thinking about the next Nintendo console. Dolphin screenshots, more of the same hype building. Duck Dodgers future look, based on the cartoon, probably a platformer. Bomberman, the second attack preview, can't go wrong with Bomberman for multiplayer mayhem. Planet Game Boy, covering handheld gaming too. Skill Club Millennium, sounds like a puzzle game perhaps. Bad Losers, why bad guys always fail. Bit of a strange article title, maybe some kind of editorial piece. Perfect Dark website exposed, probably some early internet shenanigans. And Reader Awards, letting the readers have their say. Along the bottom, there are small screenshots for Bomberman, Stunt Racer 64, Winback, Planet Game Boy, and Track and Field 2000. Look out! Over 50 pages of brand new N64 games. Standard magazine cover boast. And the platform logos at the bottom, PlayStation, Dreamcast, N64, and Game Boy Color, covering all bases. Acclaim Sports logo, they were churning out games left, right and center back then. Standard N64 magazine cover really, packed with previews and reviews.